The revolver felt heavier than it should in Nathaniel Cross's bare hand, metal biting cold enough to burn skin in the February wind that screamed down from the high peaks. Snow fell in diagonal sheets across the small cemetery clearing, accumulating on the simple granite marker that read, Elena Margaret Cross, beloved wife and mother, 1850 to 1877. 18 months of visiting this spot every week had worn a path through the pine needles and frozen earth. And now he stood at the end of that path with the weight of silence pressing on his chest like a man drowning beneath ice. The gun was his father's, a Colt Army revolver that had survived the war and 2 decades of frontier life. One bullet sat in the chamber. The others he had removed that morning, placing them in careful alignment on his desk like soldiers standing at attention for a final inspection. He had written letters too, sealed and addressed to his children, to his lawyer in Denver, to the foreman who kept Cross Ridge Timber running despite its owner's increasing absence from the world of practical concerns. His thumb found the hammer, drawing it back with a click that seemed too loud even against the howling wind. The children were with Judith today, his late wife's sister, who had installed herself at Cross Ridge after the funeral and never left. Carrie would be sitting by her window as always, staring at nothing with those ancient eyes and a 9-year-old face. Ben would be hiding under furniture, startling at footsteps like a beaten dog. They barely spoke anymore, barely moved through the world as anything more than ghosts of the children they had been before their mother's final illness took her from them. Took her. The lie tasted bitter even in his thoughts. Elena had not been taken by fever or consumption or any of the honest deaths that claimed women in this unforgiving territory. She had chosen to leave, slipping away in the night while he slept in the chair beside her bed where he had maintained his useless vigil. The household had found her at dawn in the old trapper's cabin at the edge of the property, surrounded by the withered remains of the wildflower garden she had planted in better days. Laudanum bottle empty in her hand. No note, no explanation. Just absence where presence had been, and silence that screamed louder than any accusation. The barrel rose to his temple. His finger found the trigger. The wind paused as if the mountain itself held its breath. A hand caught his wrist, iron strong and sudden. Jake Porter's weathered face materialized through the snow, his expression carved from granite and 40 winters of survival in country that killed the weak and unlucky with equal indifference. Not today, boss. Nathaniel's arm trembled against the pressure. His voice came out broken, unfamiliar to his own ears. I failed her. I fail them every day I keep breathing. Jake wrenched the revolver away with surprising gentleness, uncocking the hammer and slipping it into his coat pocket. Your children need a father, not a martyr. Elena made her choice. You don't get to make the same one and call it justice. The words hit harder than fists. Nathaniel's knees buckled, and he found himself kneeling in the snow before the grave marker, Jake's hand on his shoulder the only anchor keeping him from disappearing entirely into the white void of grief and self-loathing. The new teacher arrives this afternoon. Judith's been preparing the east cabin all week. Jake's tone shifted to something almost careful, as if speaking to a man standing on a cliff edge. Those children deserve better than what they have had. Maybe this one will last longer than the others. 5 teachers in 18 months. Each one had fled Cross Ridge within weeks, unable to bear the oppressive silence that hung over the settlement like fog, the weight of grief that seeped from the timber walls and made every breath feel like theft. Judith had sent them all away with cold dismissals and colder recommendations, maintaining standards that no desperate schoolteacher could meet. But this latest hire had come through channels Judith could not control, recommended by the Episcopal Diocese in Denver and funded by a charitable trust that required Cross Ridge to provide education for the settlement children or face legal complications regarding the land grants. Nathaniel let Jake pull him to his feet. The cemetery blurred through the snow and something else he refused to name tears. He walked back toward the main house without looking back at the grave, each step an act of will against the gravity of that place pulling him down into the frozen earth. The settlement sprawled across a natural bench in the mountainside, protected from the worst winds by towering pines and granite outcrops that rose like cathedral walls on 3 sides. The main house stood at the center, a 2-story structure of weathered logs and fieldstone that Nathaniel had built with his own hands in the first year of his marriage, when the future had seemed limitless and bright. Outbuildings clustered around it, housing the workers and their families who kept the timber operation running, the sawmill that processed logs into lumber for the growing town's downslope, the stables and storage sheds, and all the infrastructure of a working settlement carved from wilderness. Crossridge Timber employed 30 men and provided for perhaps 70 souls in total when counting weaves and children. It was a kingdom of sorts, though Nathaniel took no pleasure in ruling it. The work continued because Jake Porter knew his business and the men respected strength even in a broken vessel. Money flowed through proper channels, contracts were fulfilled, and the machinery of commerce ground forward, regardless of whether its nominal owner walked among the living or merely haunted his own life. Judith waited on the porch of the main house, her posture rigid as a hanging judge. She wore black as she had since Elena's death, severe wool dress buttoned to her throat and cinched at a waist that seemed to grow narrower with each passing month, as if she were slowly disappearing into her own bones. Her hair, black as her sister's had been, pulled back in a style that added years to her 38, and her eyes tracked Nathaniel's approach with the intensity of a raptor marking prey. "The wagon arrived an hour ago. I've installed her in the east cabin as arranged." Each word emerged clipped and precise, disapproval radiating like heat from iron. "She seems very young, too young for this position, in my opinion." Nathaniel climbed the steps without responding, his boots leaving snowmelt on the wooden planks. "I will not have another flighty girl disrupting this household. The children require discipline and structure, not coddling from some inexperienced. Did you offer her refreshment after her journey?" His voice came out flat, drained of everything except exhausted courtesy. Judith's mouth compressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Porter brought tea and bread." The girl seemed grateful enough, though her manners are those of someone accustomed to better circumstances. One wonders what brings a person of evident breeding to such reduced positions. The implication hung between them. Scandal or ruin, those were the usual reasons educated women found themselves teaching in remote settlements for room and board and a pittance that barely constituted wages. Nathaniel had stopped caring about such things 18 months ago, when caring about anything became a burden too heavy to carry. He moved past Judith into the house, shedding his snow-covered coat and hanging it on the peg by the door that still held Elena's cloak, moth-eaten now and smelling of dust and abandonment. The main room opened before him, familiar as his own skin and foreign as a landscape from someone else's dream. The furniture they had selected together in Denver. The curtains she had sewn during her first pregnancy, fingers nimble with anticipation of the life growing inside her. The rocking chair where she had nursed both babies and sung lullabies in a voice like honey and sunlight. All of it mocked him now with its persistence, its refusal to acknowledge that the woman who had made this house a home no longer walked among these objects that remembered her touch. Carrie sat in her usual spot by the window, book unopened in her lap, eyes fixed on the valley that stretched below Cross Ridge toward the distant plains. Her blonde hair hung loose around thin shoulders, and her hands rested motionless on the leather binding as if she had forgotten what reading meant. She did not turn when Nathaniel entered, did not acknowledge his presence with any sign that she registered the world beyond whatever internal landscape consumed her attention. Ben huddled under the dining table, visible only as a small shape wrapped in blankets, knees drawn to chest in the universal posture of a creature trying to make itself too small to be hurt. He had hidden there since morning, refusing breakfast and the gentle coaxing of Mrs. Porter, who had tried to lure him out with promises of fresh bread and berry preserves. Nathaniel crossed to his daughter, kneeling beside her chair, so his face came level with hers. Her eyes remained fixed on the distance, pupils dilated as if she stared into some vast darkness only she could perceive. "Carrie, a new teacher has arrived. She'll begin lessons tomorrow." No response, not even a flicker of recognition that words had been spoken in her hearing. Dieter Matthews from Denver had examined her after Elena's death, pronouncing her physically healthy but suffering from what he termed nervous exhaustion brought on by shock and grief. Time and routine would restore her, the doctor had promised, prescribing fresh air and gentle activity and the sort of platitudes that meant nothing to a child whose mother had vanished into death without warning or explanation. 6 months of time and routine had passed. Carrie remained locked in her silence like a princess in a tower of glass, visible but unreachable. Nathaniel rose, joints protesting the cold and the weight of kneeling before absent gods. He moved to the table where Ben hid, crouching so he could see beneath the heavy oak planks. "Ben, come out, son. It's safe." The boy's dark eyes peered at him through the gloom, wide with an animal wariness that cut deeper than any blade. This was not the child who had climbed into his lap demanding stories, who had laughed at the simplest jokes and found wonder in snowflakes and pine cones, and all the small miracles that filled a young life with joy. This was a creature reduced to pure survival instinct, trusting nothing and no one, waiting always for the next blow that would send him tumbling into whatever abyss had swallowed his mother. "I won't hurt you. I would never—" The words dried in Nathaniel's throat. He had made promises before. Elena had believed them once, in the early years when marriage seemed like salvation and love felt strong enough to carry any burden. He had promised to make her happy, to keep her safe, to build a life worth living in this beautiful and terrible wilderness. Look how well those promises had held against the crushing weight of isolation and winter darkness, and whatever demons had finally driven her to swallow poison and slip away into permanent silence. He withdrew from under the table, straightening with effort that had nothing to do with physical strain. Judith watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. They need stability, consistency, not another stranger who will leave when the work proves too difficult. Her tone carried something almost like concern, though it tangled with judgment in ways that made sincerity impossible to separate from censure. "I know you believe I am too harsh, but someone must maintain standards in this household. Someone must ensure these children do not grow up believing chaos and sentiment constitute proper raising." Nathaniel looked at his sister-in-law, really looked at her for the first time in months. She stood in Elena's house, wearing Elena's mourning, occupying the space Elena had left vacant. But she was not Elena, would never be Elena no matter how thoroughly she erased every trace of softness and replaced it with rigid propriety. Let her try. What harm can it do that hasn't already been done? Judith's face hardened into something approaching anger, though it passed too quickly to name with certainty. "As you wish, but when she fails, as the others failed, do not expect me to salvage what remains." She turned and swept from the room, skirts rustling against the floorboards, in a sound that seemed to echo long after she had disappeared up the stairs to the second floor, where she maintained her own quarters in defiant isolation from the rest of the household. Nathaniel stood alone in the gathering dusk, surrounded by children who could not speak and furniture that remembered better days. The afternoon light faded toward evening, painting the snow outside in shades of blue and purple that made the world look frozen beneath ice that would never thaw. Somewhere in the settlement, a new teacher unpacked her belongings and prepared to meet the family that would become her responsibility. He wondered how long this one would last before Cross Ridge broke her spirit and sent her fleeing back to whatever life she had abandoned for this position. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows and making the house creak like a ship laboring through storm seas. Winter held the high country in a grip that would not release for another 2 months at least, maybe longer if the spring came late, as it sometimes did. 2 months of darkness and cold, and the slow suffocation of being trapped in close quarters, with grief too large to contain and too persistent to escape. Nathaniel climbed the stairs to his own room, the one he had shared with Elena until her final months when her condition had required constant watching and the bed had become a prison rather than sanctuary. He closed the door and stood in the dimness, looking at the belongings that marked this space as his without making it feel like home. The desk where he maintained his correspondence and business records. The wardrobe holding clothes that seemed to belong to some other man who had once cared about appearance and propriety. The bed where he no longer slept, preferring the chair by the window, where he could watch the night pass in slow increments and count the hours until dawn brought another day identical to all the days before it. On the desk sat the letters he had written that morning, still sealed and waiting for a death that Jake Porter had postponed. Nathaniel gathered them up and carried them to the fireplace, kneeling before the cold hearth. One by one he fed the envelopes to the small flames he coaxed from kindling, watching the paper blacken and curl and release its words to smoke and ash. The wax seals melted, red droplets falling like blood onto the burning parchment. When the last letter had been consumed, he remained kneeling before the fire, hands clasped in an attitude of prayer, though no words came. He had stopped believing in gods who listened the day Elena died. If divine providence governed the world, it was a cruel and capricious force that demanded worship while offering nothing but suffering in return. The evening bell rang from the settlement chapel, calling workers to the communal supper that Mrs. Porter organized each night. Nathaniel did not move. He had lost his appetite months ago, eating only when Jake physically placed food in front of him and stood watch until at least a few bites had been consumed. His body had thinned to whipcord and sinew, burning through reserves of strength that seemed inexhaustible even as exhaustion dogged every movement. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, a soft knock at the door. "Mr. Cross?" The voice was unfamiliar, clear and steady, with an accent that spoke of education and refinement. "I'm Grace Hartley. I apologize for the intrusion, but I was told I should introduce myself before beginning duties tomorrow." Nathaniel rose from before the fireplace, brushing ash from his hands. He opened the door to find a young woman standing in the hallway, holding a candle that cast warm light across features that seemed designed for smiling, though her expression remained carefully neutral. She wore a simple gray wool dress, travel-worn but clean, and her light brown hair had been pinned up in a style that suggested practicality rather than fashion. Her eyes, a striking shade of green that reminded him of pine needles in summer, met his with a directness that felt almost challenging. "Miss Hartley," he managed the words through a throat tight with disuse. "Welcome to Cross Ridge." She curtsied with economical grace, neither deep enough to suggest servility nor shallow enough to imply disrespect. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Cross. I hope to prove worthy of the trust placed in me." The formality felt absurd given the circumstances, but he appreciated her effort to maintain proper boundaries. Too many of the previous teachers had tried sympathy or worse, had looked at him with pity that made his skin crawl with the urge to flee. "The children are—" He paused, searching for words that would not sound like excuses or warnings. "They have been through considerable difficulty. They may not respond immediately to instruction or kindness." Something shifted in Grace Hartley's expression, a flicker of understanding that it suggested she had known loss herself and recognized its marks on others. "I understand grief takes many forms, Mr. Cross. I will not expect more than they can give." Her voice carried a gentleness that did not feel cloying or false. Nathaniel found himself studying her face, noting the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested she was older than her appearance initially indicated, perhaps in her early 20s rather than the girlish teenager he had first assumed. There was a steadiness to her bearing, a quality of quiet strength that reminded him of the pines that bent before winter storms but did not break. "If you have questions or requirements, Jake Porter manages the settlement operations. Mrs. Porter handles household matters. Miss Cross, my late wife's sister, oversees the children's care and welfare." He spoke the titles like reciting inventory, reducing human relationships to their functional components, because anything more felt beyond his capacity for articulation. Grace nodded, absorbing the information without comment. She seemed to sense that prolonged conversation would tax him beyond endurance. "I will do my best not to add to your burdens, Mr. Cross. Good evening." She curtsied again and turned away, her footsteps retreating down the hallway toward the stairs. Nathaniel watched her go, the candle flame casting dancing shadows that made her seem to flicker between substance and ghost. He closed the door and returned to his chair by the window, settling into the familiar discomfort of another long night stretching ahead. But something had shifted, some infinitesimal adjustment in the weight pressing on his chest. Perhaps it was Jake's intervention at the cemetery, pulling him back from the edge when instinct and despair had urged him forward. Perhaps it was the presence of this new teacher, her calm competence suggesting that not everything in the world had to be broken beyond repair. Or perhaps it was simply that a man could only carry so much grief before even the heaviest burden became routine, background weight that shaped movement without preventing it entirely. Snow continued falling through the darkness, accumulating on the roof and windowsills, muffling sound until the world contracted to this room, this chair, this man sitting watch over a life that felt increasingly disconnected from any future worth imagining. But he did not retrieve his father's revolver from wherever Jake had hidden it. He did not write new letters or make new plans for ending what seemed unendurable. He simply sat and watched the night pass, and when dawn broke gray and cold over the eastern peaks, he rose and prepared to face another day, because that was what the living did, even when living felt like the cruelest punishment imaginable. Grace Hartley woke in the east cabin to frost patterns on the window glass and the sound of wind testing the shutters for weakness. The room was small but well-appointed, containing a narrow bed with thick quilts, a writing desk, a wardrobe that held her few belongings with room to spare, and a fireplace where coals from last night's fire still glowed dull red beneath ash. Someone had brought fresh wood during the night, stacking it neatly beside the hearth with the kind of silent competence that characterized well-run households even in frontier settlements. She rose and dressed quickly in the cold, pulling on wool stockings and a practical dark blue dress that had been mended at the cuffs but remained serviceable. Her trunk sat open at the foot of the bed, revealing the sum of her portable life. Books mostly, gifts from her father before his death, and the collapse that had followed, reducing the Hartley name from respectability to scandal in a matter of weeks. She had fled Philadelphia with creditors calling, and her mother's tears still wet on her cheeks, seeking distance from ruin and, perhaps, redemption through work that mattered more than the hollow social performances that had consumed her girlhood. Teaching had not been her first choice. It had been her only choice after the banking scandal destroyed her father's reputation and left the family with debts that would take generations to clear. The Episcopal diocese had been kind enough to offer placement in exchange for minimal wages, and she had accepted with the desperation of someone who understood that survival sometimes required swallowing pride and accepting whatever life offered. Crossridge had seemed like exile when she read the assignment letter. Now, washing her face in water from the pitcher that had frozen overnight and required breaking through a thin crust of ice, she wondered if exile might be exactly what she needed. Distance from the wreckage of her former life, space to become someone new, untainted by association with her father's crimes and her family's disgrace. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find a woman in her 40s, sturdy and capable looking, holding a tray with steaming coffee and fresh bread. "Good morning, Miss Hartley. I'm Sarah Porter. My husband Jake manages the settlement operations." The woman's smile was genuine, reaching eyes that suggested she found reasons for warmth even in this frozen landscape. "Thought you might appreciate breakfast before meeting the children." Grace accepted the tray gratefully, the coffee's heat seeping through the ceramic cup into her cold hands. "That's very kind, Mrs. Porter. I hope I'm not creating extra work." Sarah waved away the concern. "We take care of our own here. Lord knows this place needs some brightness, and children especially need someone who'll give them proper attention." The last few teachers didn't last long enough to unpack, if you understand my meaning. The implication was clear. Crossridge had a reputation for breaking teachers, though whether that was due to the isolation, the work demands, or something more specific remained unclear. "I'm not easily discouraged, Mrs. Porter. I've survived worse than difficult students." Something in Sarah's expression sharpened, as if she heard layers beneath the simple statement. "It's not the students you need to worry about, miss. It's the grief that lives in this house like another person. It'll try to pull you down if you let it." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Mr. Cross is a good man carrying a terrible burden. The children are innocents caught in the aftermath. And Miss Judith, well, she has her own ways of seeing things." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Grace filed it away for future consideration. "I'll remember that. Thank you for your concern." Sarah nodded and departed, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and the rapidly cooling breakfast. She ate standing by the window, looking out at the settlement as it came to life in the gray dawn. Men emerged from cabins and headed toward the sawmill and timber yards, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Children played in the snow between buildings, their shouts and laughter a sharp contrast to the oppressive silence she had sensed in the main house last evening. This was a working settlement, not some genteel establishment where teaching meant guiding privileged children through literature and deportment. These families depended on cross-ridge timber for their livelihoods, and education was a luxury squeezed between the demands of survival and commerce. Grace would need to prove her worth quickly or face the same dismissal that had claimed her predecessors. She finished breakfast and prepared her teaching materials, the books and slates and chalk that constituted her professional equipment. The settlement maintained a small schoolroom in one of the outbuildings, but Judith Cross had informed her yesterday that Carrie and Ben would receive private instruction in the main house, separate from the settlement children. The arrangement struck Grace as odd, perpetuating isolation rather than encouraging the social contact that might help grieving children reconnect with normal life. But she was in no position to question household decisions made by people who had survived here long before her arrival. At the appointed hour, she crossed the clearing toward the main house, her boots crunching through snow that had frozen overnight into a crust strong enough to support her weight. The sky remained overcast, threatening more snow before evening, and the wind carried the scent of pine smoke and sawdust from the mill operation that formed the economic heart of the settlement. Judith Cross met her at the door, expression as severe as yesterday, posture rigid with the kind of self-discipline that made relaxation seem like moral failure. The children are in the East Parlor. I have arranged books and materials appropriate to their ages and abilities. You will conduct lessons from 9 until noon, breaking for luncheon, then resume from 1 until 3 in the afternoon. The children will have 1 hour of outdoor activity daily, weather permitting, though I expect you to ensure they are properly supervised and do not engage in roughhousing or other unseemly behavior. Grace listened to the litany of instructions, noting the emphasis on control and propriety. This was a woman who believed structure could substitute for affection, that rules and schedules might wall out the chaos of grief and loss. I understand, Miss Cross. May I ask about their current level of instruction? What subjects have they been studying? Judith's mouth compressed into its characteristic thin line. Carrie reads at an advanced level but has not demonstrated interest in continuing her studies since her mother's passing. Benjamin can recognize letters and form simple words, but lacks focus and discipline. I expect you to remedy these deficiencies with appropriate rigor. The clinical assessment revealed nothing of the children as individuals, only their failures to meet some invisible standard of achievement. Grace kept her expression neutral. I'll do my best to meet their needs while encouraging progress at a pace suited to their circumstances. Judith's eyes narrowed slightly, as if detecting criticism in the carefully diplomatic phrasing. See that you do. Mr. Cross has been too lenient in his grief, permitting behaviors that would not be tolerated in properly managed households. The children require firm guidance, not indulgence. She led Grace through the house to the East Parlor, a bright room with large windows overlooking the valley. Carrie sat exactly as Grace had glimpsed her the previous evening, motionless by the window with a book forgotten in her lap. Ben had wedged himself into the corner behind a heavy armchair, visible only as a small shape partially hidden by shadow and furniture. Grace's heart contracted at the sight. These were not simply grieving children. These were children who had retreated so far into themselves that the world must seem like a distant country they no longer had the strength or desire to visit. Judith departed with a final reminder about maintaining discipline and reporting any difficulties immediately. The door closed, leaving Grace alone with 2 children who showed no acknowledgement that a stranger had entered their space. She approached Carrie first, moving slowly and keeping her voice gentle. Good morning, Miss Carrie. My name is Grace. I've come to keep you company and perhaps share some stories if you'd like to hear them. No response. The girl's blue eyes remained fixed on the valley, tracking something invisible or perhaps nothing at all. Grace settled into the chair beside her, not pressing for reaction, simply making her presence known without demands or expectations. I brought a book from my own collection. It's about a girl who lived alone in a lighthouse and learned to speak with seabirds. Would you like me to read it aloud? Silence stretched between them, filled only with the ticking of a mantel clock and the whisper of wind against glass. Grace opened the book anyway, balancing it on her lap where Carrie could see the illustrations if she chose to look. She began reading in a clear, steady voice, not performing or dramatizing, but simply offering the words as a gift that required nothing in return. After 20 minutes, she sensed rather than saw Carrie's eyes shift from the window to the page. The girl's head did not turn, her posture did not change, but some quality of attention had focused on the story being woven through the quiet room. Grace continued reading until she reached a natural stopping point, then closed the book and set it aside. We'll continue tomorrow if you'd like. For now, perhaps we might try some simple drawing? I find that pictures sometimes speak more clearly than words. She moved to the table where Judith had arranged supplies, retrieving paper and charcoal sticks. She placed them within Carrie's reach, but did not insist, instead beginning to sketch on her own sheet. Letting her hands move freely across the page in simple lines and curves that slowly resolved into the shape of a bird in flight. 30 minutes passed, then a small hand reached out and took a charcoal stick. Grace kept her attention on her own drawing, not wanting to spook this fragile connection with excessive enthusiasm or attention. From the corner of her eye, she watched Carrie begin to make marks on the paper, hesitant at first but growing bolder as the shapes emerged. When the clock struck 11, Grace glanced at Carrie's drawing. The girl had created something that looked like a garden, though all the flowers hung upside down with their roots, reaching toward a sky rendered in heavy black strokes. It was the image of a world inverted, where growth pointed toward darkness instead of light. Grace's throat tightened, but she kept her voice calm. That's a powerful image, Carrie. Sometimes gardens need to rest underground before they can bloom again. The girl's hands stilled over the paper. For the first time, her eyes met Grace's directly, and the depth of pain in that blue gaze stole breath and words alike. Then Carrie looked away, setting down the charcoal and returning to her vigil by the window, as if the brief moment of connection had exhausted some reserve too precious to spend carelessly. Grace turned her attention to Ben, still hidden behind the armchair. She moved to the floor, sitting cross-legged, where he could see her without feeling cornered or threatened. "Hello, Benjamin. I know you're there, and I know you might not want to talk. That's all right. I brought something I think you might like to see." She pulled from her pocket a small wooden horse her father had carved for her 20th birthday, its surface worn smooth by handling and time. She placed it on the floor between them, close enough for him to reach without leaving his hiding spot. "This horse belonged to my father. He made it with his own hands before he died. I used to pretend it could run faster than the wind and carry me anywhere I wanted to go." Ben's dark eyes appeared around the edge of the chair, focused on the carved horse with an intensity that suggested toys had become scarce in his world of grief and caution. "Would you like to hold it? I promise you can give it back whenever you're ready. It doesn't mind being borrowed." A long pause. Then a small hand darted out, snatched the horse, and retreated into shadow. Grace smiled, not pushing for more. "Keep it safe for me until tomorrow. I'll tell you more about the adventures we had together, if you'd like to hear them." The morning stretched toward noon, and Grace continued her patient work, alternating between reading aloud and sitting in companionable silence, letting the children adjust to her presence without demands for interaction or response. When the lunch hour arrived and Judith appeared to collect them, Carrie had completed 3 more drawings, each one slightly less dark than the first, and Ben had ventured far enough from his hiding place that Grace could see his full face, round-cheeked and solemn beyond his 6 years. Judith's expression suggested skepticism at the lack of visible academic progress, but she said nothing, merely ushering the children from the room with instructions for proper table manners and comportment. Grace gathered her materials and prepared to take her own meal in the east cabin, but a voice stopped her as she reached the door. "Miss Hartley?" She turned to find Nathaniel Cross standing in the hallway, appearing less haggard than yesterday but still carrying the weight of exhaustion like a physical burden. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, searched her face with an intensity that felt like being measured against some internal standard she could not guess. How did they respond? Grace chose her words carefully, sensing that false optimism would insult this man who had already endured too many hollow reassurances. Carrie drew pictures. Ben accepted a toy from my hand. They did not speak, but they allowed my presence. It's a beginning. Something in Nathaniel's expression shifted, a minute easing of tension around his eyes and mouth. That's more than the others achieved in weeks. Perhaps. He stopped, seeming to catch himself before hope could gain too strong a foothold. "Thank you for your patience with them." Grace met his gaze directly, understanding that honesty mattered more than comfort in this house haunted by lies told and truths avoided. I know something of loss, Mr. Cross. I won't pretend grief can be fixed with cheerfulness or ignored through distraction. But I believe your children can find their way back to life if someone is willing to walk beside them through the darkness. The words hung between them, weighted with meanings neither fully articulated. Nathaniel nodded once, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge something beyond the surface conversation. The East Cabin is yours for as long as you remain. If you need anything for the children's education or your own comfort, inform Jake Porter. He turned and walked away before Grace could respond, his footsteps echoing through the hallway in rhythm with the ticking of unseen clocks marking time that passed but brought no healing. Grace returned to her cabin and ate a solitary meal, thinking about the family she had committed to serving. A man drowning in grief and guilt, two children locked in their own private prisons of loss, and a woman who seemed to mistake control for care and rigidity for strength. The situation was worse than any letter from the diocese had suggested, but Grace had not traveled across half a continent to flee from difficulty. She had come seeking purpose, redemption through work that mattered more than social standing or family reputation. These children needed someone who would not abandon them when the work proved challenging. Nathaniel Cross needed someone who could witness his pain without demanding he perform recovery on a schedule designed to ease others' discomfort. In the afternoon, Grace made a decision that would alter everything. She took a walk through the settlement, needing air and movement after hours confined to the parlor's studied quiet. The paths were well maintained despite the snow, leading between buildings and workshops, past the chapel with its modest bell tower, through the workers' residences where families lived in close quarters but seemed warmer for the proximity. At the edge of the cleared area, she found a trail leading into the pines. It was not marked or maintained like the settlement paths, but something drew her forward, a pull she could not name but felt compelled to follow. The trail wound through trees that grew so close together, their branches interlaced overhead, creating a tunnel of green darkness even in midday. Snow lay deeper here, undisturbed except for animal tracks, and the silence felt different from the oppressive quiet of the main house, more peaceful than suffocating. After 20 minutes of walking, the trail opened into a small clearing where an old cabin sagged beneath accumulated snow and the weight of abandonment. The structure was perhaps 20 feet square, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray, with a stone chimney crumbling at one end and windows that gaped empty like the eyes of skulls. But it was the area in front of the cabin that arrested Grace's attention and stopped her breath in her throat. Someone had planted a garden here, a wild riot of flowers that must have been spectacular in bloom, but now stood frozen and dead, brown stems protruding through the snow like the fingers of corpses reaching for sky they would never again see. The placement was deliberate, forming curves and patterns that suggested careful design, and among the dead vegetation, Grace could identify the withered remains of columbine and lupine and Indian paintbrush, all flowers native to the high country, but cultivated here with intention and love. She knelt in the snow, removing her glove to touch the frozen stems. They crumbled slightly under her fingers, brittle with death and winter cold, but the roots remained intact beneath the frozen earth. Beneath the surface of death, life waited for conditions that would allow growth to resume. Grace had grown up in a house with gardens, had learned from her mother the art of coaxing beauty from soil and seed. She understood instinctively that this garden had been loved, tended with care and patience by someone who believed in the power of living things to transform space into sanctuary. A sound behind her made Grace turn sharply. Nathaniel Cross stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression unreadable, but carrying an intensity that made the air between them feel charged with electricity before a storm. No one has entered this place for 18 months. His voice was low, controlled, but something moved beneath the surface like dangerous currents under ice. Grace rose to her feet, brushing snow from her skirts. "Forgive me, Mr. Cross. I didn't know this area was forbidden. I was simply walking and found the trail." He moved closer, his eyes tracking from her face to the dead garden and back again. "My wife loved these flowers. She spent hours here, talking to them as if they could understand. She said they listened better than people. never interrupted or judged or demanded she be something other than what she was. The past tense struck like a hammer blow. This had been Elena Cross's garden, her refuge from whatever demons had finally driven her to choose death over continued struggle. Grace understood with sudden clarity that she was standing in sacred space, a shrine to the woman whose absence shaped every aspect of this settlement's present. "I'm sorry, I'll leave immediately." Nathaniel's hand shot out, catching her arm before she could retreat. The touch was brief, barely a moment of contact, but it burned through the wool of her sleeve with an intensity that shocked them both. He released her instantly, stepping back as if he had touched something forbidden. "The flowers died when she did. Nothing has grown here since." Grace looked down at the frozen garden, seeing it now through the lens of Elena Cross's final days. Had she come here at the end, seeking comfort from the living things she had nurtured? Had she sat among these flowers and made the choice that would leave her children motherless and her husband destroyed? "Not everything is dead here, Mr. Cross." The words emerged without conscious thought, pulled from some deep certainty Grace had not known she possessed. "Some things just sleep, waiting for the right moment to bloom again." Nathaniel's eyes locked on hers, and for a suspended moment, the world contracted to the space between two people, standing in a clearing where death and the promise of life existed in uneasy balance. His expression shifted through emotions too quick and complex to identify, settling finally into something that looked almost like pain. "You should return to the settlement before dark. This path can be treacherous for those unfamiliar with its turns." He turned and walked away without waiting for response, disappearing into the pines as silently as he had appeared. Grace stood alone in the clearing as afternoon light began its early winter fade toward evening. She looked at the cabin with its sagging roof and broken windows, at the garden that had been loved and then abandoned, at the snow falling in slow spirals from a sky heavy with the promise of storms. Something in this place called to her, spoke to the part of her soul that believed broken things could be mended and dead gardens could bloom again if someone cared enough to tend them through their dormancy. She did not know if her instinct was wisdom or foolishness, but she knew with sudden certainty that she would return to this clearing, would put her hands into the frozen earth and try to coax life back into roots that everyone else had given up for lost. The walk back to the settlement took longer than the journey out, darkness coming fast in the way of mountain winters when the sun disappeared behind western peaks and twilight lasted barely long enough to navigate home. Grace found her way through growing shadows, guided by the lights of the settlement that glowed warm against the gathering night. A porter had left another meal in the east cabin, along with fresh wood for the fire and a note expressing hope that the first day had gone well. Grace ate mechanically, her mind still in the clearing with those dead flowers and the memory of Nathaniel Cross's hand on her arm, brief as lightning and twice as searing. She prepared for bed early, exhausted by emotion and the altitude that made every breath feel insufficient. But sleep eluded her, and she found herself sitting at the small desk with pen and paper, writing a letter to Beth Morrison, the friend who had helped arrange this position and who waited in San Francisco for news of how the great adventure was unfolding. The words came slowly at first, then faster as Grace tried to capture the strangeness of her new situation. The grieving children who moved through the world like ghosts of themselves. The stern woman who policed behavior with rules that seemed designed to prevent feeling rather than encourage growth. The man who carried loss like a visible burden, bending under weight that never lightened no matter how much time passed. And the garden. Grace wrote about the garden, the dead flowers in the cabin, and the sense that this place held secrets that would take time and patience to uncover. She wrote about her certainty that beneath the surface of death, roots waited for someone willing to believe in the possibility of resurrection. But she did not write about the moment Nathaniel Cross had touched her arm, or the way her heart had lurched in her chest at the contact, or the expression in his eyes when he looked at her as if she might be something other than another temporary teacher passing through his life without leaving lasting mark. Some truths were too new and uncertain to commit to paper, even in letters to trusted friends. Some feelings needed time in darkness before they were ready to face light and examination. Grace folded the letter without sealing it, intending to finish tomorrow when her thoughts had settled and she could write with clearer judgment about her first impressions of Cross Ridge and the family she had committed to serving. She placed it between the pages of her journal for safekeeping, not knowing that this small act of preservation would later serve as evidence in a trial that would determine her future and the futures of everyone connected to this remote settlement haunted by grief and secrets. She extinguished the lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the wind test the cabin's walls and the sound of her own breathing in the small space. Tomorrow she would return to Carrie, and Ben would continue the patient work of building trust and creating space where feeling might be safe again. Tomorrow she would navigate Judith Cross's watchful supervision, and Nathaniel Cross's careful distance, would perform the role of teacher while learning the complex dynamics of a household broken by loss and struggling towards some uncertain form of healing. But tonight, in the last moments before sleep finally claimed her, Grace thought about dead gardens and the faith required to put hands into frozen earth, believing that spring would come again and life would return to places everyone else had abandoned as beyond salvation. She thought about this, and she understood that she had found something in the wilderness that she had been searching for without knowing what she sought. Purpose. The chance to matter in ways that went beyond surface performance and social obligation. The opportunity to stand witness to suffering without flinching away or demanding it conform to timelines and expectations that had nothing to do with the actual work of grief and recovery. Grace Hartley had come to Cross Ridge fleeing scandal and seeking distance from ruin. But lying in darkness in a cabin at the edge of wilderness, she began to suspect she had found something far more important than escape. She had found a place where her presence might actually make a difference, where the work she did with her hands and heart could change lives in ways that mattered more than any social success or family redemption she had left behind in Philadelphia. The wind howled through the pines, and snow whispered against the windows, and Grace slipped into sleep with the image of dead flowers waiting for spring imprinted on her closed eyelids, like a promise or a prayer. 6 weeks transformed Cross Ridge from frozen tomb to tentative resurrection. March arrived with temperatures that climbed above freezing during daylight hours, and the snow that had seemed eternal began its slow retreat into mud and running water. Icicles dripped from eaves in steady percussion, and the sound of the creek that ran through the lower settlement rose from whispered aurora as snowmelt from the high peaks poured downslope in foaming torrents that carried away winter's debris and cleared paths for whatever spring might bring. Grace had not returned to Philadelphia. This fact surprised her more than it probably should have, given that the diocese contract bound her for a minimum term, and breaking it would leave her with no references and fewer prospects than she already possessed. But the surprise came not from staying, but from wanting to stay, from waking each morning in the East cabin and feeling something that resembled purpose rather than mere obligation. The children had begun to emerge from their separate prisons of silence and fear. Carrie now spoke in full sentences, her voice soft but clear, asking questions about the books they read together and occasionally offering observations about the world beyond her window that suggested she had started noticing details again, instead of staring through everything towards some internal landscape of grief. She still spent long periods in silence, still retreated into herself when emotion threatened to overwhelm fragile defenses, but the stretches of engagement grew longer each week. Ben had abandoned his hiding places entirely, though he remained cautious in ways that broke Grace's heart with their implications about what trust cost a child who had learned that the people you loved could vanish without warning. He followed Grace through the settlement now. When afternoon lessons ended, chattering about birds and rocks and all the small wonders that filled a 6-year-old's expanding universe. He had returned the carved horse after 3 days, placing it carefully in Grace's palm with a solemnity that made the gesture feel like some sacred exchange of vows. "You can keep it if you want," Grace had offered, meaning the words. Ben shook his head, dark curls bouncing with the movement. "It's yours, but maybe I can borrow it sometimes? When I need to go somewhere fast?" The metaphor was too apt to be accidental. This child understood that escape remained a possibility even as he began to risk staying present in a life that had already demonstrated its capacity for sudden loss. Grace had started working on the garden 3 weeks after her first discovery of the clearing. She told no one of her intention, simply taking her afternoon walks in that direction and spending an hour each day clearing away the dead vegetation, carefully removing brown stalks and withered leaves to expose the soil beneath. The ground remained frozen several inches down, but the surface thawed enough during sunny afternoons to allow her fingers to work through the top layer, removing debris and preparing for whatever might lie dormant below. She found bulbs beneath the mulch of dead flowers, dozens of them, planted in deliberate patterns that would have created waves of color from early spring through late summer. They looked desiccated, shriveled like the fingers of ancient corpses. But when Grace cut one open with her pocket knife, the interior showed green tissue still viable beneath the dried outer layers. Life persisted even after 18 months of neglect and the killing cold of 2 high-country winters. The discovery filled her with an emotion too large to name. If these bulbs could survive, perhaps other dead things might find paths back to living. Perhaps children who had forgotten how to laugh could remember joy. Perhaps a man crushed beneath guilt and loss could learn to carry his burdens without being destroyed by their weight. Grace began bringing small supplies to the clearing. A trowel borrowed from Mrs. Porter's garden shed, packets of wildflower seeds purchased from the general store in Pine Creek during a rare trip down the mountain for household supplies, a small notebook where she sketched the garden's layout and made plans for how it might look when spring fully arrived and the threat of killing frost finally passed. She told herself this was simply a project, a way to occupy hands and mind during hours not devoted to teaching. But she knew in the honest darkness before sleep claimed her that the garden had become something more. It was an act of faith, a declaration that beauty could return to places marked by death, a bet against despair that life would find a way through frozen ground toward light and warmth and the possibility of blooming again. Nathaniel had not returned to the clearing during her work there, though she sometimes felt watched in ways she could not verify or dismiss. Twice, she found fresh wood stacked beside the old cabin's door, cut to stove length and split with the efficiency of someone who had performed the task 10,000 times. No note accompanied the gift, but Grace knew who had left it. The knowledge settled in her chest like warmth from swallowed whiskey, burning and spreading until she could not tell where the heat ended and her own response began. Their interactions remained formal and brief. He asked about the children's progress during chance encounters in hallways, or when she submitted weekly reports detailing lessons completed and skills developing. She answered with careful professionalism, listing accomplishments and challenges without editorializing or offering opinions about matters beyond her purview. But something had shifted in the quality of his attention when she spoke, a focus that felt like being seen rather than merely observed. The night Carrie took fever, everything changed. It started with a cough during afternoon lessons, dry and harsh, like branches scraping against windows. Grace noted it but did not worry over much, attributing the symptom to dust or the dry indoor air that came from keeping fires burning constantly against the cold. But by evening meal, the cough had deepened to something that rattled in the child's narrow chest, and her forehead blazed hot enough to make Grace's palm tingle with transferred heat. Judith summoned Dr. Matthews from Pine Creek, but the journey would take hours, even in good conditions, and the weather had turned foul with sleet falling in sheets that made the mountain roads treacherous for horses and riders alike. In the meantime, Carrie's temperature climbed toward dangerous levels, and her breathing took on a labored quality that Grace recognized from her own childhood when pneumonia had nearly killed her younger sister. Mrs. Porter brought cool water and clean cloths. Grace stripped Carrie down to her shift and began bathing her limbs and torso with the methodical patience of someone who understood that fever fought with steady persistence rather than dramatic gestures. The girl's skin burned like forge-heated metal, and her eyes had gone glassy with delirium, tracking things that existed only in the fever's hallucinations. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway near midnight, his face drawn and pale beneath the lamplight. "How is she?" Grace wrung out the cloth she had been using, the water in the basin already warm from Carrie's heat. "The fever hasn't broken. I'm trying to keep her temperature from climbing higher until the doctor arrives." He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed where Carrie lay restless and murmuring fragments of sentences that made no sense strung together. His hand found his daughter's forehead, and Grace saw him flinch at the contact. "Elena's fever felt like this. Near the end." The words emerged barely above whisper, confession forced past barriers that had held for 18 months. Grace's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Carrie is young and strong. Fever is the body fighting infection, not surrendering to it. Nathaniel looked at her across the bed, his eyes holding a desperation that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than she had yet witnessed. I can't lose her too. I can't. His voice broke on the words, splintering into silence. Grace made a decision that would haunt and bless her in equal measure for years afterward. She reached across the bed and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a certainty that had nothing to do with propriety or the careful boundaries that should exist between employer and employee. Then help me fight. Two people can keep watch better than one. His fingers tightened on hers, the pressure speaking volumes about need and fear, and the relief of not having to carry every burden alone. They remained like that for a long moment, hands clasped across Carrie's fevered body, while the clock ticked and the sleet hammered against windows and something fundamental shifted in the space between two people who had been strangers 6 weeks ago, but now found themselves allied in a battle that mattered more than comfort or convention. They worked through the night in tandem, taking turns bathing Carrie's limbs, while the other prepared fresh water, or adjusted blankets, or simply sat holding the child's hand while she thrashed through fever dreams. They did not speak much, but the silence felt companionable rather than oppressive, the shared focus creating an intimacy that words might have disrupted or cheapened. Near 3 in the morning, both of them reached simultaneously to check Carrie's forehead, their hands meeting on her brow and tangling together in an accident of timing that froze them both in place. Nathaniel's palm covered the back of Grace's hand, and she could feel his pulse hammering against her knuckles, could sense the way his breath caught and held for a suspended moment, while the world contracted to the point of contact between skin and the electric current that seemed to flow through that touch like lightning seeking ground. Neither pulled away. Grace felt her own heartbeat accelerate, pounding so hard she wondered if he could hear it in the quiet room. His eyes locked on hers, gray depths reflecting lamplight and something else she could not name, but recognized in her own chest as it unfurled like flowers opening to sun after long dormancy and darkness. Carrie stirred beneath their joined hands, murmuring something that sounded almost like words. The spell broke and they withdrew simultaneously, the separation feeling like loss despite lasting only seconds. Nathaniel stood abruptly and moved to the window, ostensibly checking for signs of the doctor's arrival, but more likely needing distance from whatever had just passed between them. Grace returned her attention to Carrie, though her hands trembled slightly as she wrung out the cloth and resumed her patient bathing of heated limbs. The fever had not broken, but it had stopped climbing, and the child's breathing seemed marginally easier than an hour ago. Progress came in such small increments, barely visible against the larger threat. But Grace had learned that most battles were won through accumulated tiny victories, rather than single dramatic turning points. Dr. Matthews arrived near dawn, sleet-soaked and irritable from the dangerous ride through darkness and storm. He examined Carrie with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen too much suffering to waste energy on sympathy, pronouncing her condition serious but likely to resolve with proper care and time. Keep the fever down, plenty of fluids if you can get her to drink. Watch for signs the infection is settling in her lungs. If her breathing worsens or you hear crackling when she inhales, send for me immediately. He packed his instruments back into his worn leather bag. You've done well keeping her temperature from spiking dangerously. Another few hours unchecked and we might have been facing convulsions or worse. The praise felt unearned. Grace had simply done what needed doing, driven by instinct and the memory of watching her own mother fight to save her sister from similar fever. But Nathaniel's expression suggested he heard something more in the doctor's words. Some confirmation that Grace possessed capabilities beyond book learning and classroom management. The fever broke 3 hours after the doctor's departure, Carrie's temperature dropping swiftly from dangerous heights to something approaching normal. She woke confused and weak, her voice barely audible when she whispered for water. Grace held the cup while she drank, supporting her head with a gentleness that made the child's eyes fill with tears. Don't leave, Carrie managed between sips, her small hand clutching Grace's sleeve with surprising strength. I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I promise. Carrie's gaze shifted past Grace to where Nathaniel stood watching from across the room. Mama Grace stayed all night. She kept the bad dreams away. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, ripples spreading outward through a silence that suddenly felt charged with implications no one had intended but everyone understood. Nathaniel's face went through several expressions too quickly to catalog, settling on something that looked almost like pain, mixed with gratitude, and perhaps something deeper that Grace did not dare examine too closely. Judith chose that moment to enter, her arrival breaking the tableau with the efficiency of shears cutting thread. The crisis has passed then. Excellent. Miss Hartley, you should retire to your cabin and rest. You look quite exhausted. The dismissal was clear, but beneath it, Grace heard something sharper than mere concern for her welfare. She met Judith's gaze and saw calculation there. Assessment of threats and adjustments to whatever internal strategies governed this woman's relationship to the household she had claimed as her domain. Grace nodded and rose, tucking Carrie's blankets more securely around her small form. Sleep now. I'll check on you this afternoon. She left the room without looking back at Nathaniel, though she felt his attention following her like physical touch. The hallway seemed longer than memory suggested, and her legs trembled with exhaustion in the aftermath of adrenaline that had sustained her through the long night. She made it to the east cabin and collapsed on the bed fully clothed, sleep claiming her before she could remove even her shoes. When Grace woke near noon, she found a tray beside her bed, holding coffee that had gone cold and bread that remained fresh beneath a cloth napkin. A note in Mrs. Porter's handwriting read simply, "You did good work last night. Thank you for caring." The words unknotted something in Grace's chest that she had not realized had drawn tight. She had been thanked before in her life, received praise for accomplishments, both real and exaggerated. But this felt different. This was recognition for labor that mattered beyond social performance or the accumulation of credentials. She had helped save a child's life. Nothing she had done in Philadelphia, no ball attended or charitable committee served, had ever approached that level of genuine importance. She rose and washed hastily, changing into a clean dress and pinning her hair with more care than she had managed during the crisis hours. When she crossed to the main house for afternoon lessons, Ben met her at the door and threw his arms around her waist with an enthusiasm that nearly knocked her backward. "You made Carrie better. Papa said you stayed all night and fought the fever like a warrior fighting a dragon." Grace laughed, the sound surprising her with its spontaneity. "I just kept her cool and comfortable. The doctor and your sister's own strength did the real work." Ben shook his head vigorously, dark curls flying. "No, you saved her. Papa told me. He said you knew exactly what to do, and you didn't get scared even when it was really bad." The image of Nathaniel discussing her actions with Ben in terms of praise rather than mere factual reporting sent warmth spreading through Grace's chest. She disentangled herself from Ben's embrace and followed him to the parlor where Carrie rested on the sofa, propped by pillows and looking pale but alert. "Mama Grace!" The child's face lit with a smile that transformed her features from solemn to something approaching the joy that should characterize a 9-year-old's expression. Grace's step faltered at the title, its implications both precious and dangerous given the household dynamics and her position as hired help, rather than family member. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Carrie patted the sofa beside her in invitation. "Tired, but better. Will you read to me? I want to hear more about the lighthouse girl and the seabirds." Grace settled beside her and opened the book to their marked page, but her mind tracked multiple layers beneath the simple act of reading aloud. Carrie had claimed her with that title and had renamed their relationship into something that transcended the teacher-student boundary and entered territory that could provoke complications. Grace was not certain she knew how to navigate. But looking at the child's eager face and feeling Ben curl against her other side as the story unfolded, Grace could not bring herself to correct the designation or enforce a distance that would protect her position while wounding children who had already lost too much. The days that followed Carrie's recovery developed a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy, despite the undercurrents of tension that ran beneath surface routines. Grace continued her morning lessons in the parlor, watching both children blossom as their trust deepened and they began to risk the vulnerability of learning new things and admitting ignorance without fear of judgment or punishment. She introduced them to mathematics through story problems about traveling merchants and farmers calculating harvests, made grammar lessons into games where constructing sentences earned points and prizes, turned history into adventure tales about explorers and revolutionaries who had shaped the nation through courage and vision. Judith observed these lessons with increasing frequency, appearing unannounced in the doorway and watching with expressions that suggested skepticism mixed with something harder to identify. Grace sensed disapproval but could not determine its source. The children were learning, their skills improving measurably each week. They laughed more, spoke more freely, engaged with the world around them in ways they had not since their mother's death. By any objective standard, Grace was succeeding where previous teachers had failed. But success, it seemed, could be its own provocation for those who preferred order maintained through different means. Grace worked on the garden every afternoon, the ritual becoming as essential to her well-being as sleep or food. The weather continued its slow warming trend, and the ground thawed deeper each day, allowing her to dig and prepare soil that had been locked beneath ice for months. She planted the wildflower seeds in careful rows, following patterns she had sketched in her notebook, covering them with loose earth and whispering encouragement that felt foolish but also necessary. Some afternoons she felt watched, that prickling awareness of eyes tracking her movements from somewhere among the pines. She never turned to look, unwilling to confirm or deny the sensation. If Nathaniel chose to observe her work from distance, that was his prerogative as owner of this land and the memories it held. But one afternoon he appeared openly, stepping into the clearing with an expression that suggested he had been wrestling with the decision to make his presence known. He carried an axe over one shoulder and a canvas bag that clinked with the sound of tools. "The cabin needs repairs before the roof collapses entirely. I thought I might work on it while you tend the garden." The statement hung between them, invitation and question combined. Grace straightened from where she knelt in the dirt, brushing soil from her hands, though the stains had become permanent fixtures. "I'd welcome the company." Something in Nathaniel's shoulders eased, tension she had not consciously noticed releasing at her acceptance. He set to work without further conversation, and for the next 2 hours they labored in parallel silence. The sound of his axe biting into rotten timbers counterpointed the softer percussion of her trowel and earth. And gradually the quiet between them filled with the kind of ease that comes when people discover they can exist together without requiring constant verbal connection. Grace finished planting a section of columbine seeds and sat back on her heels, allowing herself a moment to rest and observe. Nathaniel had removed his coat despite the lingering chill, working in shirt sleeves that revealed the lean muscle of a man who performed physical labor as routine rather than recreation. His movements carried the efficiency of long practice, no wasted motion or hesitation, each strike of the axe deliberate and controlled. He glanced up and caught her watching. For a suspended moment, they simply looked at each other across the clearing, the distance between them feeling both vast and negligible. Then Nathaniel set down the axe and crossed to where Grace knelt, settling on his heels beside her garden plot. "You've made progress here." Grace indicated the newly planted rows, wildflowers mostly, native species that should survive the altitude in the short growing season. "If even half germinate, this place will be beautiful by midsummer." Nathaniel reached out and touched one of the withered stalks she had left standing as markers for the bulbs beneath. Elena used to say the flowers understood her in ways people didn't. She'd spend entire afternoons here, talking to them about fears and frustrations she couldn't voice anywhere else. This was the most he had spoken about his late wife directly, and Grace sensed the importance of receiving the confidence without flinching or offering platitudes. Plants are good listeners. They accept what we give them without demanding we be different or better than we are. Nathaniel's hand stilled on the dried stem, and when he spoke again, his voice carried weight that suggested he was saying something that mattered beyond the surface meaning of the words. "You've given my children something I didn't know they had lost. Hope, maybe, or the belief that life can hold moments of joy, even after experiencing profound pain." Grace's throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his eyes directly. "They're remarkable children, Mr. Cross. They've survived losses that would break many adults. My role is simply to witness their strength and give them space to heal at their own pace." His gray eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "You diminish your contribution. What you've done in 6 weeks surpasses what anyone else managed in months of trying." The praise should have felt professional. acknowledgement from employer to employee of satisfactory performance. But something in the way he looked at her, the particular quality of attention he focused on her face, transformed the words into something more personal and far more dangerous to the careful boundaries Grace had been trying to maintain. She stood abruptly, needing distance and movement to contain the feelings rising in her chest like floodwaters testing levees. I should return to the settlement. It's getting late. Nathaniel rose more slowly, not reaching for her, but not moving away either. The space between them hummed with potential energy, all the things neither dared say, but both increasingly felt. Grace. Her given name and his voice sounded different, intimate and careful at once. Thank you. For the children. For this garden. For staying when others would have left. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she attempted response. Then she gathered her tools and walked back down the trail toward the settlement, feeling his attention follow her until the pines blocked his line of sight and released her to breathe normally again. That evening, Nathaniel appeared at her cabin door after supper, holding a leather-bound volume that looked old and well-handled. I found this among Elena's things. It's a collection of botanical illustrations from the Western Territories. I thought you might find it useful for identifying native species when planting the garden. Grace accepted the book, noting how its weight settled in her hands with a solid presence of quality binding and careful craftsmanship. She opened it to reveal watercolor paintings of extraordinary detail and beauty, each plant labeled with both common and scientific names. This is exquisite. Are you certain you want to lend it to me? Nathaniel's expression flickered with something that might have been pain or might have been the beginning of its release. Elena would have wanted it used rather than gathering dust in a trunk. She believed beautiful things existed to be shared, not hoarded. Grace clutched the book against her chest, understanding that this gift represented more than the loan of a useful reference. It was permission to occupy space Elena Cross had claimed, to continue work the dead woman had started, to perhaps become something more than temporary presence in a household still haunted by loss. I'll take excellent care of it. Thank you for trusting me with something that belonged to her. Nathaniel lingered in the doorway, seeming to want to say more but unable or unwilling to push past whatever internal barriers still governed his capacity for expression. Finally, he simply nodded and turned away, disappearing into the twilight that was settling over the settlement like a blanket pulled close against encroaching darkness. Grace closed the door and carried the book to her desk, opening it to study the illustrations by lamplight. The paintings were masterworks of patient observation, capturing not just the appearance of each plant, but some essential quality of its being, the particular way it inhabited space and responded to light and weather. Elena Cross had possessed artistic skill beyond casual hobby. These were the works of someone who saw deeply and translated vision into form with discipline and talent. Grace found herself wondering about this woman whose absence shaped everything at Cross Ridge. What had driven someone with such evident gifts into isolation and eventually despair deep enough to choose death? Had Nathaniel failed her in ways he believed, or were there demons that predated their marriage? Wounds no amount of love could heal because they reached into places beyond another person's capacity to touch? The questions had no answers, or at least none Grace could access from her position outside the true inner circle of the household. But they mattered because understanding Elena might help her understand the children who carried their mother's loss like invisible scars, and the man who walked through each day carrying guilt for whatever he believed he might have done differently to prevent the tragedy that had shattered his family. 10 days after Carrie's fever broke, Major Edmund Whitmore arrived at Cross Ridge without warning or announcement. Grace first became aware of his presence when she heard unfamiliar voices in the main house during afternoon lessons. She continued working with the children on their geography lesson, but her attention divided as she tried to determine who had arrived and why the visit had provoked what sounded like tension in the adult voices carrying through walls and closed doors. When lessons concluded, she found Judith waiting in the hallway with an expression that managed to combine disapproval and something approaching satisfaction. "We have a guest for the evening. Major Whitmore is Mr. Cross's business associate and my late sister's uncle. He has traveled from Denver to discuss timber contracts and other matters." Judith's pale eyes fixed on Grace with peculiar intensity. "You will join us for dinner this evening. The major has expressed interest in meeting the teacher who has achieved such reportedly remarkable results with the children. The phrasing suggested Judith had her own opinions about those results, none of them particularly flattering. Grace nodded her acceptance of the command, understanding this was not invitation but requirement. She returned to her cabin and changed into her best dress, a dark green wool that had been expensive once and remained well-made despite the years of wear. She pinned her hair more formally than usual and allowed herself the vanity of the small cameo brooch that had belonged to her grandmother, one of the few items she had salvaged from the wreckage of her family's financial collapse. The dining room at Cross Ridge was a space Grace had glimpsed but never entered during her tenure. It occupied the north end of the main house, a large chamber dominated by a table that could seat 12 and walls hung with landscape paintings depicting mountain scenes in romantic style. The table had been set with china and silver that spoke of better days and maintained standards, candles providing warm light that softened the harsh angles of the room's masculine furnishings. Major Whitmore rose when Grace entered, his movements crisp with military bearing despite civilian dress. He appeared to be in his late 40s, tall and solid with iron gray hair and a mustache waxed to precise points. His eyes were sharp and assessing, taking in details about Grace with the efficiency of someone trained to evaluate situations quickly and accurately. "Miss Hartley, I've heard impressive reports about your work with the Cross children." His voice carried authority without aggression, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed but not requiring demonstrations of dominance to ensure compliance. Grace curtsied with appropriate formality. "You're kind to say so, Major Whitmore. The children's progress is their own achievement. I simply provide structure and encouragement." Nathaniel watched this exchange from his position at the head of the table. His expression unreadable, but his posture carrying tension, Grace had learned to recognize as discomfort with social performance. Judith presided at the opposite end, her black dress and severe styling making her look like a widow mourning fresh loss rather than a sister still processing grief 18 months cold. The meal proceeded with the stilted quality of formal dinners, where conversation must navigate multiple hidden currents and unspoken agendas. Major Whitmore spoke about Denver's growth, the expansion of railroad lines into mountain territories, political developments in Washington that might affect timber regulations and land grants. Nathaniel responded with the minimal engagement of someone performing obligation rather than enjoying discourse. But the major's attention kept returning to Grace, his questions probing her background and qualifications with a thoroughness that felt almost like investigation. "You mentioned Philadelphia, Miss Hartley. Which district did your family occupy?" Grace's fingers tightened on her fork, but she kept her voice steady. "Society Hill originally, though circumstances changed after my father's death." Something flickered in Whitmore's expression, a sharpening of focus that made Grace's pulse quicken with warnings she could not yet name. "And your father's profession?" The question crossed boundaries of polite inquiry into territory that threatened exposure Grace had traveled across a continent to avoid. But refusing to answer would provoke more curiosity than honesty managed carefully. "He taught classical languages at the university. His death left the family in reduced circumstances, which led to my seeking employment in education." Technically true, though it omitted the financial scandal and the criminal investigations and her mother's collapse into invalidism from shame and stress. Whitmore appeared to accept the explanation, though his eyes suggested he heard gaps in the narrative that would bear further examination. After dinner, the men retired to Nathaniel's study for business discussions that excluded both women. Judith cornered Grace in the hallway before she could escape to her cabin. "The major is a shrewd judge of character, Miss Hartley. He sees through pretense and values honesty above all other virtues." The words carried warning rather than mere observation. "I hope you have been forthright about your qualifications and background. Deception discovered later reflects poorly on everyone associated with the deceiver." Grace met Judith's gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated by implications she could neither confirm nor deny. "I have misrepresented nothing about my ability to teach or my commitment to the children's welfare, Miss Cross. My personal history before arriving at Cross Ridge has no bearing on my professional competence." Judith's mouth compressed into its characteristic thin line. "Perhaps, but in my experience, those who flee their pasts usually carry stains that cannot be washed away through geographical distance or assumed virtue. Time reveals all secrets, Miss Hartley. I hope yours will not prove damaging to this household when they inevitably surface. She swept away before Grace could formulate response, leaving her alone in the dimly lit hallway with the certain knowledge that Judith suspected something and would not rest until suspicions became confirmation. Grace returned to her cabin with thoughts churning through scenarios of discovery and consequences. If her connection to the Hartley banking scandal became known, would it cost her this position? Would the children be taken from her care and given to some other teacher untainted by family disgrace? The questions kept her awake long into the night, watching shadows move across the ceiling, while wind rattled windows and her mind conjured increasingly dark possibilities. 2 days after Major Whitmore departed, Nathaniel requested Grace's presence in his study for what he termed a matter of some importance. She entered the room with trepidation, uncertain whether she faced dismissal or simply some administrative concern about the children's curriculum. The study revealed more about Nathaniel Cross than any conversation had yet accomplished. Books lined 2 walls, a collection that ranged from agricultural treatises to poetry volumes, history texts to philosophy, suggesting a mind that sought understanding across broad territories of human thought. A large desk dominated the space, its surface organized with the precision of someone who needed external order to contain internal chaos. Windows overlooked the valley, providing views that stretched for miles across forested ridges toward distant plains. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back to the door when Grace entered. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and she saw immediately that whatever he needed to discuss, it had cost him considerable emotional energy to initiate the conversation. "Please sit." He gestured toward a leather chair near the fireplace where a small blaze fought against the lingering spring chill. Grace settled into the chair, folding her hands in her lap and waiting for him to begin. He remained standing, moving to lean against the desk in a posture that suggested he needed the furniture's support. "Major Whitmore raised questions about your background. Not accusations precisely, but concerns about what he termed insufficient documentation of your credentials and history." Nathaniel's tone carried no judgment, only a weariness that spoke to how little he cared about such matters weighed against larger griefs. "I told him your work with the children speaks more clearly than any letters of reference could about your competence and character." Relief and something warmer flooded through Grace's jointed down. "Thank you for your confidence, Mr. Cross. I assure you my commitment to Carrie and Ben's welfare is genuine and absolute." Nathaniel nodded, but his expression suggested he had more to say and was finding the words difficult to access. "The Major also suggested I should perhaps consider remarriage. For the children's sake," he argued, "and for my own welfare. He believes grief indulged too long becomes its own form of self-destruction." Grace's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain still and listen without visible reaction. "I told him I had no interest in such matters, that the idea of replacing Elena felt like betrayal of everything she meant to me and desecration of the life we built together." The words should have brought relief. Instead, they settled in Grace's stomach like stones, weighting her with the understanding that whatever she felt for this man, who occupied increasing amounts of her thoughts and dreams, he remained locked in fidelity to a ghost. Nathaniel moved from the desk to the fireplace, standing close enough that Grace could have touched him if she had dared extend her hand. "But then I find myself thinking about someone who has brought light back into my children's lives, who works in my late wife's garden without seeking permission or recognition, who stayed awake all night fighting fever alongside me as if she had equal stake in my daughter's survival." His voice had dropped to something barely above whisper, each word weighted with meaning that made Grace's heart hammer against her ribs. "I find myself thinking about these things, and I wonder if perhaps Major Whitmore sees something I've been too blind or too afraid to acknowledge." Grace rose from the chair, needing to stand for whatever came next because sitting felt like accepting a subordinate position in a conversation that demanded equality of presence. "Mr. Cross." "Nathaniel." The correction was gentle but firm. "When we're alone, I would prefer you call me Nathaniel." The intimacy of using his given name felt dangerous and necessary in equal measure. "Nathaniel, then." I won't pretend I don't understand what you're suggesting, but I need you to be certain about what you're feeling. Grief makes people seek comfort in ways they might later regret, and I won't allow myself to be a temporary balm for wounds that require different healing. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that stole her breath. What I feel when I look at you is not comfort, Grace. It's something far more complicated and terrifying. It's the first time since Elena's death that I've felt anything besides guilt and the urge to follow her into whatever darkness claimed her. The confession hung between them like a live thing, pulsing with all the need and fear and possibility that neither had dared voice until this moment. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Though whether from sadness or glee or the overwhelming complexity of emotions churning through her chest, she could not determine. I'm afraid, she whispered, the truth forced past defenses that had seemed impenetrable hours earlier. I'm afraid of caring too much and losing everything again. I'm afraid of what it means that the children call me Mama Grace and I don't correct them. I'm afraid that loving you would be the most foolish and most inevitable thing I've ever done. Nathaniel closed the distance between them, his hand rising to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted the controlled strength she knew resided in those work-hardened palms. Then be afraid with me, because I'm terrified of everything this could mean and everything it could end. But I'm more terrified of letting you slip away because I was too much a coward to admit that you've become essential to my capacity to keep breathing. Grace's hand came up to cover his where it rested against her cheek, and for a suspended moment they stood locked in that pose, two people balanced on the edge of a precipice that could lead to flight or falling, but offered no safe ground to stand upon while avoiding the leap entirely. The study door opened without warning, and Judah's voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a blade through silk. I apologize for the intrusion, but I require Mr. Cross's signature on. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes tracking from Nathaniel's hand on Grace's face to their proximity and the unmistakable quality of interrupted intimacy that hung in the air between them. Her expression transformed from surprise to calculation to something that looked almost like triumph before settling into cold disapproval. I see I've interrupted a private moment. How inappropriate of me, and how illuminating. Nathaniel dropped his hand and stepped back, but the damage was already done. Judith had seen exactly what she needed to see to confirm suspicions and fuel whatever schemes she had been nurturing since recognizing that Grace threatened her control over the household. It's not what you imagine, Judith. His sister-in-law's smile was sharp as broken glass. Isn't it? Forgive me, but it appeared quite precisely what one would imagine when an employer forgets his position and indulges inappropriate familiarity with hired help. Grace felt the words like physical blows, each one landing with precision designed to wound and diminish. She straightened her shoulders and met Judith's gaze without flinching. If I have overstepped boundaries, Miss Cross, I apologize. It was not my intention to create complications or discomfort in this household. Judith's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction or malice or both combined. Intentions matter less than actions, Miss Hartley, and actions observed cannot be unobserved, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. She placed the papers requiring signature on Nathaniel's desk and departed, leaving behind a silence that felt poisoned by implications and the certainty that whatever had been building between Grace and Nathaniel had just become known to the one person most invested in preventing its development. Grace moved toward the door, needing escape from the sudden heaviness that had replaced the tentative hope of moments earlier. Grace, wait. Nathaniel's voice stopped her before she reached the threshold. Don't let Judith's judgment make you regret what I hope we still might. She turned back to find him standing in the middle of his study, looking lost and determined at once. I regret nothing except that she saw before we had time to understand for ourselves what this is becoming. But I need time to think about what happens next. What's possible given the circumstances and the obstacles we face? He nodded, accepting her need for space, even as his expressions suggested he wanted to argue against delay. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. And neither are the feelings that drove me to speak today. Grace left the study and fled to her cabin, her mind racing through implications and possibilities, while her heart hammered with the memory of his hand on her face and the words he had spoken with such raw honesty. That night, she sat at her desk and wrote to Beth Morrison, the pen moving almost without conscious direction as she tried to articulate the complexity of her situation. She wrote about the children and their healing, about the garden and its slow resurrection, about Nathaniel and the way he had begun to look at her as if she might be something more than temporary presence in a life that had known too much loss. But she also wrote about fear and uncertainty, about Judith's hostility and the complications of position and propriety, about the growing suspicion that her past would eventually catch up with her no matter how far she ran or how carefully she tried to build a new life from the ruins of the old. The letter grew longer than she had intended, pages filled with confession and question and the desperate hope that Beth might offer wisdom, or at least understanding, for a situation that felt increasingly beyond Grace's capacity to navigate alone. When she finally finished, the candle had burned low and exhaustion pulled at her like physical weight. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her journal for safekeeping, intending to seal it properly in the morning when her thoughts had settled and she could review what she had written with clearer judgment. But exhaustion claimed her before she could complete that task. And she fell asleep at the desk with her head pillowed on crossed arms and the journal lying open beside her like evidence awaiting discovery. In the main house, Judith Cross stood at her window watching the light in the east cabin finally extinguish. She had spent the hours since interrupting Nathaniel and Grace, analyzing what she had witnessed and formulating plans to address a threat that had grown far more serious than she had anticipated. She had loved Nathaniel Cross since before Elena ever met him, had introduced them at a Denver society function with the secret hope that proximity might allow him to see Judith herself in new light. Instead, he had fallen for Elena's beauty and apparent fragility, had married her within 6 months and taken her away to this mountain settlement where Judith visited rarely and always with the sick awareness that she had facilitated her own heartbreak. Elena's death had seemed like opportunity finally granted. Judith had installed herself at Cross Ridge ostensibly to care for the children, but actually to position herself as indispensable, the woman who held the household together through crisis and demonstrated the kind of strength Nathaniel needed, rather than the delicate emotionalism that had characterized Elena's response to frontier hardship. For 18 months, Judith had waited, patient as stone, certain that time and proximity would eventually make Nathaniel see her worth. She had dispatched previous teachers with strategic criticism and unreasonable demands, maintaining her control over the children and ensuring no other woman gained foothold in the household. But Grace Hartley had proven more resilient than her predecessors, had somehow bypassed Judith's defenses and connected with the children in ways that made interference difficult without appearing obviously malicious. Worse, she had caught Nathaniel's attention in ways Judith had never managed, despite years of devotion and sacrifice. Tonight had confirmed what Judith had been suspecting for weeks. Nathaniel was developing feelings for the young teacher, perhaps had already fallen in love with her, though he seemed too grief-stunned to fully recognize or name what was happening. If allowed to continue, this attachment would destroy every plan Judith had nurtured through months of careful positioning. She could not permit that outcome. Would not permit it after everything she had already sacrificed for the hope of eventually claiming what she believed should rightfully be hers. Judith moved from the window to her writing desk, extracting paper and pen. She composed a letter to Major Whitmore, suggesting in carefully coded language that further investigation into Miss Hartley's background might prove illuminating for everyone concerned with Cross Ridge's welfare. She mentioned Philadelphia and financial scandal, planted seeds of suspicion that would bloom into questions the Major's military precision would pursue until answers emerged. But investigation took time, and Judith wanted more immediate insurance against the threat developing in her household. She needed evidence that would discredit Grace beyond recovery, proof of impropriety or deception that would give Nathaniel no choice but to dismiss the teacher and acknowledge that Judith had been right to question her fitness for the position. She sealed the letter to Major Whitmore and set it aside for posting. Then she sat in darkness, planning, calculating, waiting for opportunity to present the weapon she needed to destroy Grace Hartley's influence. Before it became too entrenched to uproot without collateral damage, Judith was not yet prepared to accept. In the east cabin, Grace slept with her journal lying open on the desk, pages covered with confessions and questions and hopes written in her own hand. The words waited there like ammunition stored in an unlocked arsenal. ready to be discovered and deployed by anyone with sufficient motivation to invade privacy in service of larger strategies. Neither woman knew that their conflict had already been decided by choices made and barriers crossed. Neither understood that the battle being waged over Nathaniel Cross's heart and Crossridge's future would claim casualties beyond what either had imagined in their separate vigils through the lengthening spring night. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant flowers beginning to emerge from winter dormancy. The garden Grace had planted waited in darkness for sun and warmth to trigger the germination that would transform dead earth into living beauty. The season was turning, winter releasing its grip day by day, hour by hour, as the world tilted toward light and growth and all the chaotic promise of spring finally arriving in the high country. June arrived with heat that felt shocking after months of cold, temperatures climbing into the 70s during afternoon hours, and remaining warm enough through evening that Grace could work in the garden without needing the heavy coat that had been essential equipment through spring. The wildflowers she had planted began their emergence, green shoots pushing through soil that had seemed dead beyond recovery just weeks earlier. Columbine and lupine, Indian paintbrush and mountain bluebell, all the native species that belong to this altitude and climate, responding to warmth and moisture with the determination of life that refuses to surrender even when conditions seem to forbid survival. The children flourished alongside the flowers. Carrie had begun writing poetry, short verses about birds and seasons, and the way light changed through the day as summer lengthened toward its peak. Her words carried a melancholy beauty that suggested she was processing grief through language, transforming pain into something that could be examined and perhaps eventually understood. Ben had discovered a passion for collecting rocks, filling his pockets with specimens he classified according to color and texture, creating elaborate taxonomies that demonstrated a mind hungry for order and pattern. Grace watched them grow and felt pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments and everything to do with witnessing resilience in creatures who had every reason to remain broken. They were healing themselves, really. She simply provided consistent presence and the safety of knowing an adult would remain constant even when emotions became overwhelming or memories threatened to pull them back into the darkness that had consumed the year following their mother's death. But beneath the surface progress, tensions accumulated like pressure behind a dam. Judith's discovery of the near intimacy between Grace and Nathaniel had sharpened her vigilance into something approaching obsession. She appeared everywhere Grace turned, materializing in doorways and hallways, with the uncanny timing of someone who had made surveillance into art form. Her questions about Grace's background became more pointed, probing details that should have been irrelevant to teaching qualifications, but suggested Judith's suspected scandal beyond the poverty that had driven Grace to seek frontier employment. Nathaniel maintained careful distance in Judith's presence, his formality with Grace so pronounced it bordered on coldness. But when they encountered each other away from his sister-in-law's observation, his eyes held a warmth that made Grace's breath catch and her pulse accelerate into rhythms that had nothing to do with exertion or altitude. They had not resumed the conversation interrupted in his study, had not addressed the feelings acknowledged that afternoon, but the awareness hummed between them like current air through wire, waiting for connection to complete circuits and transform potential into kinetic energy. Grace had sealed the letter to Beth Morrison and entrusted it to Jake Porter for posting during his next trip to Pine Creek. The act should have brought relief, the unburdening of thoughts too complex to carry alone. Instead, she felt exposed, as if committing feelings to paper and sending them into the world made them more real and therefore more dangerous than when they existed only in the private territory of her own mind. She did not know that the letter she had actually posted was the brief note about arriving safely and finding the children responsive to instruction. The longer letter, the one filled with confessions about Nathaniel and fears about Judith, and questions about what love might look like when built on the ruins of other people's tragedies, remained in her journal where she had placed it that night after returning from the study. She had meant to retrieve it the next morning, had fully intended to seal it properly and send it with the routine correspondence Jake carried down the mountain each week. But exhaustion and emotion had made her forget, and the letter had stayed hidden between pages devoted to lesson plans and observations about the children's progress. Hidden but not secret, available to anyone who might open the journal and read what Grace had never intended for eyes beyond Beth Morrison's sympathetic gaze. Judith found the letter on a Tuesday morning in mid-June while Grace conducted lessons in the parlor, and the children's laughter drifted through open windows into air sweet with the scent of pine and early summer flowers. She had entered the east cabin under the pretext of checking that the housekeeping staff maintained proper standards in all settlement buildings. The journal lay on Grace's desk, not concealed or locked, but simply present like any innocent object a teacher might use for recording professional observations. Judith had no intention of reading private writings, told herself she was simply confirming the room was clean and orderly. But the journal fell open when she moved it to dust beneath, and her eyes caught on her own name written in Grace's careful script. Curiosity became justification, became deliberate invasion, as Judith pulled the chair close and began reading with the focused attention of someone mining for weapons that might later be deployed in battles not yet declared openly. The letter revealed everything Judith had suspected and several things she had not imagined. Grace's attraction to Nathaniel, described in language that made clear this was not simple infatuation but something deeper and more dangerous. The children's attachment to Grace, their use of the title Mama Grace, and Grace's conflicted feelings about allowing it to continue. Fears about what Judith herself might do if she perceived Grace as a threat. But the passages that made Judith's heart beat faster was something between rage and vindication, were those discussing Grace's past. Philadelphia, the banking scandal, her father's disgrace and the family's financial collapse, the desperate flight to frontier territories where background inquiries might be less thorough and scandal less likely to follow. Judith read twice through, memorizing key phrases and specific details. Then she carefully copied several passages onto separate paper, her handwriting disguised through deliberate alteration of slant and pressure. She returned the journal to its position on the desk, arranging it precisely as she had found it, so Grace would have no reason to suspect the violation. She departed the cabin with evidence secured in her dress pocket and a plan forming with the clarity that comes when strategy finally has concrete foundation rather than mere suspicion and malice. The Carson Foundation charity event was scheduled for the third Saturday in June, a gathering of Denver society transplanted to the mountains for a weekend of carefully orchestrated philanthropy and social positioning. Nathaniel had been invited to attend as one of the territory's more successful businessmen, and Judith had encouraged his acceptance with the argument that maintaining relationships with Eastern investors required occasional demonstration of civilization, despite frontier location. She had also suggested he bring Grace, ostensibly to demonstrate the quality of education being provided to settlement children and to showcase Cross Ridge as a community invested in proper social development. Nathaniel had resisted initially, uncomfortable with the idea of subjecting Grace to the scrutiny of people who would judge her background and position with the sharp assessment Denver society brought to all social interactions. But Judith had been persuasive, arguing that Grace's presence would reflect well on the entire household and might attract the attention of other families seeking qualified teachers for their own children. The charitable framing had worked where direct pressure would have failed, and Nathaniel had reluctantly agreed to include Grace in the party that would make the two-day journey to attend the event at the Whitmore estate outside Denver. Grace learned of the plan through Judith, who delivered the news with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Mr. Cross believes your presence at the charity event would demonstrate Cross Ridge's commitment to educational excellence. You'll need to prepare appropriate attire. The gathering will include many of Denver's prominent families, and first impressions carry lasting consequences. The warning beneath the surface message was clear. Grace would be evaluated not just as a teacher, but as a woman occupying an ambiguous position in a household where boundaries between family and staff had already begun to blur. Any misstep would reflect poorly on everyone and potentially damage relationships that supported Cross Ridge's economic viability. Grace spent the following week preparing with a care that bordered on anxiety. Her wardrobe was limited, the clothes she had brought from Philadelphia sufficient for teaching, but inadequate for the kind of social event Judith described. Mrs. Porter came to her rescue, altering one of her own dresses from younger days when she had attended such gatherings before marrying Jake and moving permanently to frontier settlements. The dress was lavender silk, simple in design but well made, with lace at the collar and cuffs that added elegance without ostentation. Mrs. Porter's eyes grew soft as she pinned and tucked the fabric to fit Grace's slighter frame. "I wore this to my own engagement party 20 years ago. Jake said I looked like something from a painting, all soft colors and happiness." Her hands stilled on the fabric. "That was before we knew how hard this life would be, how many children we'd lose to fever and accident, how many winters would test whether love was strong enough to carry us through darkness." Grace touched the older woman's hand where it rested on the silk. "You and Jake seem to have found that strength." Mrs. Porter nodded slowly, her gaze distant with memory. "We did, but it took work every single day, choosing each other again and again, even when choosing felt harder than giving up." She focused on Grace with sudden intensity. "That's what real love requires, Miss Hartley. Not the easy affection of courtship, but the daily decision to stay present even when presence costs more than you think you can afford to pay." The words felt weighted with meaning beyond their surface application, as if Mrs. Porter knew or suspected what was developing between Grace and Nathaniel and wanted to offer wisdom before circumstances forced lessons learned through harder experience. Grace began feeling unwell the week before the charity event. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent queasiness that made breakfast difficult and left her exhausted by mid-afternoon, despite sleeping well through nights that had grown warm enough to require only a single blanket. She attributed the symptoms to anxiety about the upcoming social ordeal and the accumulated stress of navigating Cross Ridge's complex dynamics while trying to maintain professional boundaries that felt increasingly artificial. But the morning sickness did not abate, and Grace found herself making frequent trips to the chamber pot to empty a stomach that rejected even bland foods she had never before found problematic. A terrible suspicion began forming in her mind, a possibility she did not want to examine but could not entirely dismiss. She counted backward from her last monthly courses, realizing with growing alarm that 6 weeks had passed without the bleeding that should have arrived with predictable regularity. 6 weeks since the night she and Nathaniel had sat up caring for Carrie through her fever, since their hands had tangled together on his daughter's forehead in a moment of contact that had felt innocent but apparently carried consequences neither had anticipated. Except they had not coupled that night, had not even kissed, had touched only briefly and accidentally, the contact charged with electricity, but remaining within bounds of propriety, if not precisely within the safe territory of employer-employee distance. Grace's mind raced through the timeline, searching for other explanations. But the symptoms were unmistakable to anyone who had watched her own mother endure 7 pregnancies, who had seen sisters and cousins navigate the early months with their peculiar combination of fatigue and nausea and the subtle changes in body and appetite that mark conception's successful completion. She was pregnant. The certainty settled into her bones like lead, weighting every thought with implications she could barely begin to process. But how? When? The only time she and Nathaniel had been physically close enough for... But no, that was impossible. They had not consummated anything, had barely touched beyond that single moment of hands meeting in innocent accident. Unless... The thought came slowly, terrible in its implications. Unless Judith had been more thorough in her invasion of privacy than merely reading letters. Unless something had been added to the wine served at dinner those weeks ago when Grace had felt unusually tired and disoriented. Unless the sister-in-law, who smiled like broken glass and watched with eyes that calculated every weakness, had found a way to create exactly the scandal needed to destroy Grace's position and eliminate her as a threat. But that required a level of malice and planning that seemed beyond even Judith's demonstrated capacity for manipulation. Grace pushed the paranoia aside, telling herself she was inventing conspiracies to avoid confronting the simpler and more devastating truth. She was somehow carrying a child conceived through means she could not explain or remember, in a household where such disgrace would destroy not only her own prospects, but potentially damage Nathaniel and the children she had come to love as deeply as if they were her own blood. The charity event loomed 3 days away, and Grace could not decide whether she should confess her condition before the journey or wait until after, whether she should tell Nathaniel first or Judith, or simply pack her belongings and disappear into the wilderness before scandal could attach itself to Cross Ridge's reputation. She made no decision, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. And so when the traveling party departed for Denver on Friday morning, she was among them, her stomach roiling with nausea and dread in equal measure as the wagon carried them down from the settlement toward the gathering where her carefully constructed new life would finally and irrevocably collapse. The journey took 2 days, following mountain roads that gradually descended toward the plains where Denver sprawled at the base of the foothills, like civilization's outpost against wilderness. They stopped overnight at a way station halfway down, where Grace shared quarters with Judith and endured the older woman's pointed conversation about propriety and the importance of maintaining proper boundaries even when circumstances made such maintenance challenging. Women in positions like yours, Miss Hartley, must be especially careful about appearance and reputation. Society judges us more harshly than it judges men, and any hint of impropriety can destroy years of careful work in a single evening's carelessness. Grace murmured agreement while her stomach churned and her mind tracked the weeks until her condition would become visible, despite any efforts at concealment. 3 months, perhaps 4 if she dressed carefully, and the baby remained small. Not enough time to find new employment elsewhere. Barely enough time to make arrangements for a future that would necessarily exclude teaching or any other respectable work once her pregnancy became known. They reached the Whitmore estate late Saturday afternoon, the property sprawling across several acres at the edge of Denver proper. The house was a testament to wealth accumulated through military service and wise investment, a 3-story mansion of brick and stone that would not have seemed out of place in Philadelphia's finest neighborhoods. Carriages clustered in the circular drive, and well-dressed figures moved across manicured lawns toward tents erected for the evening's festivities. Major Whitmore greeted them personally, his military bearing unchanged since his visit to Cross Ridge months earlier, but his eyes sharpened when they fell on Grace, recognition flickering across his features in a way that made her pulse spike with warning. "Miss Hartley, how delightful to see you again." His tone carried something beneath the surface courtesy, a edge that suggested he had been thinking about her since their last encounter and had perhaps made inquiries that yielded interesting results. "I trust the journey was not too arduous. Mountain travel can be challenging for those unaccustomed to frontier rigors." Grace curtsied with as much grace as her unsettled stomach permitted. "The journey was quite manageable, Major Whitmore. Thank you for your hospitality and including me among your guests." Judith moved to stand beside Grace with proprietary positioning that suggested she considered herself responsible for the younger woman's behavior and conduct. "Miss Hartley has been an exemplary teacher to the Cross children, though of course one always hopes that standards maintained in isolation will translate successfully to more sophisticated company." The barb was subtle but unmistakable. Grace felt her cheeks heat but kept her expression neutral, unwilling to give Judith the satisfaction of visible reaction. The afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and small talk, Grace navigating conversations with Denver society matrons who assessed her with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to categorizing others into precise hierarchies of worth and acceptability. She felt their judgments like physical touch, the subtle dismissals of those who recognized her worn dress and provincial manners as markers of someone outside their natural circle. Nathaniel remained distant through these hours, occupied with business conversations and the careful networking that sustained Cross Ridge's commercial relationships. But Grace caught him glancing in her direction frequently, his expression suggesting concern mixed with something that might have been protectiveness if he had been in position to offer such shelter. As evening approached and guests began gathering for the formal dinner that would precede the charity auction, Grace retreated to the room assigned for her use. It was small but elegantly appointed, the furnishings speaking to Whitmore wealth without ostentation. She stood before the mirror, adjusting the lavender silk dress and trying to convince herself she could survive the evening without disgracing herself or the household that had taken her in. A knock at the door interrupted her preparations. She opened it to find Judith standing in the hallway wearing black silk that transformed her severity into something approaching elegance. "A word before we join the gathering, Miss Hartley." Judith entered without waiting for invitation, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded ominous in the small space. She moved to the window, her back to Grace, when she began speaking. "I know about Philadelphia, about your father and the Hartley banking scandal. about the embezzlement charges and the investors who lost fortunes when the scheme collapsed. Grace's breath froze in her lungs, but she forced herself to remain standing and meet Judith's gaze when the older woman turned to face her. I know you fled east to escape association with his crimes, that you changed nothing about your name, but hoped distance and obscurity would prevent discovery. The words fell like hammer blows, each one landing with precision designed to shatter whatever defenses Grace had thought she possessed. My past has no bearing on my qualifications as a teacher or my commitment to Carrie and Ben's welfare. Judith's smile cut like razors wrapped in silk. Doesn't it? You're the daughter of a criminal, raised in luxury, purchased with stolen money, accustomed to comforts and status that were never legitimately yours. And now you've insinuated yourself into another household, working your way into the affections of vulnerable children and a grieving man too blind with loss to see that you're using them exactly as your father used his investors. Rage surged through Grace's chest, hot and clarifying. I have used no one. I came here to teach, to build a new life away from disgrace I did nothing to earn. Whatever you believe about my motivations, you're wrong. Judith moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost intimate in its venom. Am I? Because I think you saw opportunity in Nathaniel Cross. A wealthy man damaged enough to be vulnerable. Children desperate enough for maternal attention to accept anyone who showed them basic kindness. I think you calculated exactly how to make yourself indispensable, how to position yourself to rise from hired teacher to mistress of the household through manipulation, masquerading as devotion. Grace's hand itched with the urge to strike, but she clenched her fingers into fists and kept her voice level through sheer force of will. You're describing yourself, Miss Cross. Not me. The accusation hung in the air between them, and for a moment Grace saw something flicker in Judith's eyes that might have been shock or recognition or rage before it disappeared beneath the careful control that had governed this woman's every expression since the day they met. I loved Nathaniel Cross before Elena ever met him. I introduced them because I believed proximity might make him see me in a different light. Instead, he married my sister, and I spent years watching them build a life that should have been mine. The confession emerged raw and unfiltered, Judith's composure cracking to reveal the wound beneath. Elena died, and I thought, finally I might have a chance to claim what I'd been denied. I moved across Ridge. I made myself essential. I cared for those children and ran that household and waited for Nathaniel to understand that I was what he needed, not some fragile, beautiful creature who couldn't survive frontier hardship without shattering into pieces. Grace felt something almost like pity threading through her anger. Understanding for the first time the depth of Judith's pain and the ways loving from a distance for years could corrode a soul into something capable of terrible actions. But loving someone doesn't entitle you to their return, Miss Cross. Devotion given without being requested creates no obligation in the recipient. Judith's face hardened back into the severe lines that characterized her public presentation. Perhaps not, but I will not stand by and watch another woman steal what should rightfully be mine. You will be exposed tonight, Miss Hartley. Your past will become public knowledge. And when Nathaniel understands who you really are, he will send you away and finally see that I am the woman who has stood faithfully beside him through every trial. She departed before Grace could formulate response, leaving her alone in the small room with the knowledge that the evening ahead would bring ruin regardless of how carefully she navigated social complexities. Grace sat heavily on the bed, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just been revealed. Judith had known about her background for weeks, had been gathering evidence and planning an exposure with the methodical patience of someone who had already sacrificed too much to her obsession to turn back from whatever destruction her plan required. The smart choice would be to flee immediately, pack her few belongings, slip away before dinner, make her way back to Cross Ridge, or better yet, somewhere entirely new, where neither scandal nor pregnancy could find her. But the thought of the children discovering her gone without explanation, of Nathaniel believing she had run because Judith's accusations held truth, kept Grace frozen in place, unable to act despite knowing that staying meant facing public humiliation and the collapse of everything she had tried to build. The dinner bell rang through the house, calling guests to gather for the evening's formal events. Grace stood and checked her reflection one final time, adjusting the lavender silk and pinning her hair with trembling fingers. Whatever came next, she would face it standing rather than cowering in rooms while others decided her fate. The dining hall glittered with crystal and silver, candlelight reflecting from surfaces polished to mirrored brilliance. Tables seated eight, and Grace found herself positioned between a merchant's wife who spoke of nothing but her daughter's upcoming marriage and a banker whose attention remained focused on the men at the far end of the table, discussing territorial politics and railroad expansion. Nathaniel sat across the room at the head table with Major Whitmore and other prominent guests, too distant for conversation, but positioned where Grace could see him if she glanced up from the meal she was unable to eat. Their eyes met once, and she saw concern in his expression before Judith leaned close to whisper something that made his attention shift away from Grace and toward whatever poison his sister-in-law was dripping into his ear. The meal concluded, and guests moved to the Grand Salon where the charity auction would take place, bidding on items donated by Denver's wealthy to raise funds for the foundation's work with orphans and destitute families. Grace found a chair near the back, hoping to remain invisible through the proceedings that would inevitably conclude with her exposure and disgrace. Major Whitmore took the stage to welcome guests and speak about the evening's charitable purpose. His voice carried the authority of command, and the assembled guests quieted to listen with the attention reserved for those whose social position demanded respect. He spoke about duty and community, about the fortunate having obligation to assist those broken by circumstances beyond their control. The words should have been inspiring, but instead felt like knives slowly drawn across Grace's skin, each phrase about character and integrity, cutting deeper as she waited for the inevitable moment when attention would turn to her, and all her carefully hidden secrets would be dragged into public light. Before we begin the auction, I want to share some information that has recently come to my attention regarding a matter of truth and deception within our community. Grace's vision tunneled, the salon contracting to just the major's face and the certainty that her exposure was imminent. We have among us this evening a young woman employed as teacher at Cross Ridge Settlement. Miss Grace Hartley has presented herself as a qualified educator of good character and sound background. Heads turned toward Grace, faces registering various degrees of curiosity and anticipation for scandal about to be revealed. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to remain upright in her chair, refusing to shrink or flee, even as the walls seemed to close around her. What Miss Hartley has not disclosed is her true identity. Major Whitmore's voice carried across the silent salon with the precision of a man trained to make words hit targets with lethal accuracy. She is the daughter of Jonathan Hartley, the Philadelphia banker whose embezzlement scheme defrauded hundreds of investors of their life savings before his death ended the criminal proceedings that would have resulted in decades of imprisonment. The silence that followed felt absolute. Every ear trained on the major's words, and every eye fixed on Grace with the hungry attention people bring to public executions and disasters. Miss Hartley fled Philadelphia to escape association with her father's crimes, seeking employment in territories where her name might not be recognized and her past might remain conveniently buried. Grace stood, refusing to remain seated while being tried in the court of social judgment. Her voice came out clearer than she expected, steady despite the terror hammering through her chest. My father's crimes were his own, Major Whitmore. I had no knowledge of the embezzlement and benefited from it only to the extent that any child benefits from their parents' income, legitimate or otherwise. I fled Philadelphia because remaining meant being punished for sins I did not commit, blamed for devastation I could not prevent. Nathaniel rose from his position at the head table, his face pale but determined. Miss Hartley's background is her own business. Her work with my children has been exemplary, and her character evident in every action she has taken since arriving at Cross Ridge. His defense should have brought comfort, but Grace saw Judith standing beside the major, satisfaction radiating from her like heat from a forge. This was not the end of the evening's revelations. This was merely the opening salvo, designed to establish Grace as someone who concealed truths and could not be trusted. Judith stepped forward, producing papers from her bag with the timing of someone who had choreographed this moment with the major in advance. I'm afraid there is more to reveal about Miss Hartley's deceptions. Her voice carried false sorrow, the tone of someone pained to expose wrongdoing, but compelled by duty and conscience. I discovered this letter in her private papers, written to a friend but never sent. It contains rather illuminating confessions about her true intentions toward Mr. Cross and his household. She began reading before Grace could stop her voice filling the salon with words Grace had written in privacy and never intended for public consumption. I don't know if what I feel when he looks at me is respect for his position, gratitude for his kindness, or something I don't dare name even to myself. I find myself watching for him in the mornings, listening for the sound of his voice, noticing the way the light falls across his shoulders when he stands in the clearing at sunset. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, understanding too late that Judith had found and copied the letter, had saved it for exactly this moment when maximum damage could be inflicted with minimum effort. It seems Miss Hartley has been developing quite inappropriate feelings for her employer, allowing the children to call her by a maternal title, positioning herself to rise from hired help to mistress of the household through emotional manipulation. The assembled guests murmured with the delicious scandal of it all, a teacher seducing her widowed employer, a woman with criminal family background insinuating herself into a respectable household through calculated displays of devotion to vulnerable children. Nathaniel moved through the crowd toward Grace, his expression stricken. "Is this true? Did you write this?" Grace met his eyes, seeing the question there was not about the feelings described, but about whether she had concealed them while pretending professional distance. "I wrote it, yes, a private letter to a trusted friend, expressing confusion about feelings I didn't understand and wasn't certain how to navigate. Feelings I never acted upon beyond the honesty we shared in your study before Judith interrupted us." She turned to face the crowd, her voice growing stronger as anger burned through the paralysis of shame. "I am guilty of being Jonathan Hartley's daughter. I am guilty of developing feelings for a man whose kindness and grief moved me more than I expected when I accepted this position. But I am not guilty of deception or manipulation or using children to advance my own interests." Judith's smile was triumphant, sharp, and cold as mountain ice. "How convenient that you mentioned the study, Miss Hartley. The same study where my brother-in-law was discovered with his hand on your face in a moment of intimacy that exceeded all bounds of propriety between employer and employee." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Enough, Judith. You have made your point. Grace's past is her own business, and her feelings, if she has them, reflect only well on her honesty and humanity." Major Whitmore stepped forward, his expression grave. "I'm afraid I must speak plainly, Cross. As Elena's uncle and someone who cares deeply about your children's welfare, I cannot in good conscience then allow a woman of such questionable background to continue in a position of trust within your household." The words landed like verdict from judge pronouncing sentence. Grace felt something break inside her chest. Not her heart precisely, but some last fragile hope that this evening might end in anything except complete devastation. She looked at Nathaniel and saw the conflict in his face. The terrible calculation of a man forced to choose between defending someone he cared for and protecting his children from association with scandal that could damage their futures and his business relationships. His silence stretched too long, and Grace understood, with crushing finality, that he would not fight for her, that whatever feelings they had acknowledged in the privacy of his study could not survive exposure to public scrutiny and social judgment. "I understand, Major Whitmore. I will remove myself from Cross Ridge immediately upon our return." She turned and walked from the salon before tears could fall, before the rage and heartbreak churning in her chest could escape in ways that would give Judith even more satisfaction than she had already extracted from this perfectly executed destruction. Grace made it to the small room assigned to her and began packing her few belongings with hands that shook so badly she could barely manage the clasps on her trunk. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, and she braced herself for Judith coming to deliver final gloating pronouncements. But it was Nathaniel who entered, his face haggard in the lamplight. "Grace, His voice broke on her name. She held up her hand, forestalling whatever he planned to say. Please don't tell me you're sorry or that you wish circumstances were different. I understand the position you're in. I understand that defending me costs more than you can afford to pay, with your children's futures and Cross Ridge's reputation at stake. He crossed to her, catching her shoulders and turning her to face him, despite her resistance. I should have defended you immediately, should have told them all to go to hell, and that your past means nothing compared to who you are now, what you've given my children, and how you've changed everything at Cross Ridge. His eyes held anguish that matched her own, but Grace could not allow his regret to soften the necessary hardness growing in her chest like scar tissue forming over wounds too deep to heal cleanly. But you didn't. You calculated that Compton found defending me too expensive. That's your right as employer and father, but it means we're done here. Whatever we might have become ends tonight in this room with me packing and you watching because you waited too long to act when action mattered. Nathaniel's hands tightened on her shoulders, his voice dropping to whisper, "Come with me anyway. Leave Cross Ridge if you must, but come with me somewhere else where your past doesn't matter and we can build something new away from Judith's poison and society's judgment." The offer tempted despite everything. The vision of escape was someone who cared enough to propose exile from everything he had built. But Grace thought about the nausea that plagued her mornings and the child growing in her womb that she had not yet found courage to mention. And she knew running together would only delay the moment when he discovered her pregnancy and had to choose again between love and the practical realities of life, lived in communities that punished women for sexual transgression while forgiving men the same behavior. No, I need to leave alone, build my own life away from anyone else's expectations or dependencies. Thank you for the offer, but I can't accept salvation from someone who wasn't willing to fight for me when the battle first required courage. She pulled away from his grip and returned to her packing, moving with mechanical efficiency because stopping would mean collapsing, and she refused to break completely while he watched. Nathaniel stood frozen in the middle of the room, looking like a man who had just watched something precious slip through his fingers while he stood paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. "Grace, please. I love you. I should have said it before, should have claimed you publicly, and damn the consequences. But I love you, and I can't lose you like I lost Elena." The words she had longed to hear now felt like stones thrown at someone already drowning. Additional weight rather than rescue. Grace stopped packing and faced him with tears finally spilling down her cheeks, despite her determination to maintain composure. "You don't get to tell me you love me after choosing silence when I needed you to speak. Love isn't words whispered in private rooms. It's action taken when action costs everything you value. You love me? Prove it by letting me go without making this harder than it already is." She turned back to her trunk, dismissing him through posture and focus on the task before her. After a long moment, she heard his footsteps retreat and the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality dressed in wood and brass. Grace finished packing and sat on the bed, exhaustion and shock finally catching up with her. She placed her hand on her still flat stomach, feeling nothing yet but knowing life grew there regardless of how ill-timed or unwanted the pregnancy felt in this moment of comprehensive collapse. A child, Nathaniel's child, conceived through means she still could not explain, but carrying his features in the genetic code spiraling into existence within her womb. A child who would be born into scandal and disgrace unless Grace could find a way to build new life somewhere far from Cross Ridge and Philadelphia both. Somewhere she could invent a dead husband and claim respectable widowhood rather than face the reality of bearing a bastard conceived through means that remain mysterious. She should tell him, should march back to wherever he had retreated and inform him that his silence tonight had cost not just their relationship, but his knowledge of and participation in raising the child they had somehow created. But the urge to wound him as she had been wounded warred with the understanding that using a child as weapon was exactly the kind of manipulation Judith had accused her of planning. The decision made itself through paralysis. Grace would say nothing about the pregnancy, would leave in the morning and make her way to some new territory where her past could remain unknown and her future could be built on lies more sustainable than the truths that had just destroyed her present. She lay down fully clothed on the bed and stared at the ceiling while tears leaked silently from the corners of her eyes into hair spread across the pillow. Somewhere in the house, the charity auction continued. People bidding on items and congratulating themselves on their generosity, while Grace's life lay in ruins and the child growing inside her represented a future too complex and terrifying to face with anything except the kind of grim determination that had carried her this far from Philadelphia's wreckage. Morning came gray and cold despite June's date on the calendar. Grace rose and washed her face, erasing the evidence of tears and grief with the same methodical attention she had learned to apply to survival tasks that required continuing when continuation felt impossible. She dressed in her traveling clothes and carried her trunk to the front entrance where the Cross Ridge wagon waited for the return journey up the mountain. Nathaniel stood beside the wagon looking haggard, as if he had not slept through the night any better than Grace had managed. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw everything he wanted to say written in his expression. Apology, regret, love that had come too late and proven too weak to withstand the first serious test of its strength. Grace climbed into the wagon without accepting the hand he offered, settling herself beside her trunk and turning her face toward the mountains that rose against the eastern sky like a wall designed to keep the plains and all their complications at a distance. Judith appeared in the doorway wearing her habitual black, triumph radiating from her despite the early hour. Safe travels, Miss Hartley. I trust you understand that your employment at Cross Ridge is terminated effective immediately. I will arrange for your final wages to be forwarded wherever you eventually settle. Grace nodded once, refusing to give Judith the satisfaction of visible reaction. The wagon lurched into motion, and Cross Ridge's small party began the journey back to the settlement, where Grace had briefly believed she might find home and purpose and perhaps even love if circumstances had aligned differently. They traveled in silence through the first day, stopping at the way station overnight before completing the climb on Sunday. Grace spoke to no one, eating mechanically when food was offered and sleeping fitfully in the communal quarters, where other travelers snored and shifted through the darkness. When they reached Cross Ridge late Sunday afternoon, Grace gathered her belongings and headed directly for the east cabin without entering the main house or attempting to see the children who would have questions about her absence she could not bear to answer. She found a brief note waiting on her desk, written in Carrie's careful hand. Mama Grace, where did you go? Ben is crying. Papa looks sad. Please come back. We need you. Love, Carrie. The words broke something in Grace that Judith's triumph and Nathaniel's silence had only cracked. She sat at the desk and wrote replies, one to each child, explaining that sometimes adults made mistakes and had to leave places they loved because staying would hurt everyone more than leaving. She did not say goodbye to Nathaniel, did not give Judith the satisfaction of a final confrontation. She simply packed her trunk onto the wagon Jake Porter had agreed to drive down the mountain to Pine Creek, where the stage to San Francisco departed twice weekly, and Grace could begin the journey toward whatever future awaited someone carrying scandal and pregnancy in equal measure. The children watched from the main house window as the wagon departed, Carrie's face pressed against the glass and Ben's small hand raised in a wave. Grace returned before facing forward and refusing to look back as Cross Ridge disappeared behind curves in the mountain road. She had come to the settlement, fleeing scandal and seeking purpose. She was leaving carrying new scandal and a child whose existence she had not yet found courage to fully acknowledge. But she was also leaving with the certain knowledge that love was not enough when courage failed. That feelings without action meant nothing when tested by consequence. Pine Creek welcomed her with indifference, the small settlement too occupied with its own concerns to care about another woman passing through on the way to somewhere else. Grace secured a room at the boarding house and waited 3 days for the stage that would carry her west toward California and whatever life she could construct from the ruins of everything she had tried to build in Colorado's high country. On her second night in Pine Creek, Grace's nausea intensified to the point where she could not hide her condition from the boarding house owner, a practical woman named Mrs. Chen, who had seen enough of life to recognize pregnancy despite Grace's loose clothing and careful movements. How far along are you, dear? Grace's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. 8 weeks, perhaps 9, I'm not certain. Mrs. Chen nodded with much judgment, her expression suggesting she had heard similar stories from other women passing through this way station between one life and the next. You'll need to see Dr. Morrison before you travel further. The stage to California is rough, and in your condition, you want to be certain everything is progressing safely. Grace visited the doctor the following morning, submitting to examination with the numb acceptance of someone who had already lost so much that further indignities barely registered. Dr. Morrison confirmed what she already knew. Pregnancy approximately 8 to 9 weeks along, mother's health adequate, though signs of malnutrition and stress required attention if she wanted to carry the child to term successfully. Do you have family waiting in California? Someone who can help you through the birth and early months? Grace shook her head, unwilling to explain the complexities of her situation to a stranger who would judge based on surface facts rather than the Byzantine emotional landscape that had led to this moment. I'll manage. Women have been bearing children without support since the beginning of time. I'm sure I'll find a way. Dr. Morrison's expression suggested he doubted her optimistic assessment, but knew better than to argue with determination born from desperation. Grace spent her final night in Pine Creek writing a letter to Beth Morrison, explaining everything that had happened since her last correspondence and asking for help finding employment in San Francisco that would accommodate her pregnancy and the need to support herself and a child once the baby arrived. She sealed the letter and paid extra for rush delivery, then lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling for the night and the distant howl of wolves hunting in the darkness beyond the settlement's protective lights. Tomorrow she would board the stage west. Tomorrow she would begin the journey toward whatever future could be salvaged from the wreckage of her past. Tomorrow she would stop looking back toward the mountains where she had left pieces of herself scattered like flowers torn apart by winter storms. But tonight, in the darkness before dawn broke over the plains, Grace allowed herself to cry for everything she had lost and everything she would never have. For Carrie and Ben, who had called her Mama Grace and believed she would never leave them. For Nathaniel, who had loved her but not enough to fight when fighting mattered most. For the child growing inside her who would never know its father or the settlement where it had been conceived in mystery. Tomorrow would require strength. Tonight could hold grief, and Grace surrendered to it completely until exhaustion finally dragged her into sleep, filled with dreams of gardens that bloomed and ate and bloomed again in endless cycles that made hope and loss indistinguishable from each other. 8 weeks passed like water flowing over stones, each day wearing away at surfaces until what remained bore little resemblance to what had existed before. August settled over Pine Creek with heat that felt oppressive after the cool mountain elevations Grace had left behind, temperatures climbing into the 80s and bringing with them dust that coated everything in fine layers of grit that no amount of sweeping could permanently remove. Grace had not continued to California. The journey required funds she did not possess after paying for lodging and medical care, and by the time she had saved enough from work at the Pine Creek Orphan School, the pregnancy had advanced to a stage where travel seemed inadvisable without risking the child she had not planned but was now grimly determined to carry to term. 14 weeks. Her body had begun changing in ways that loose clothing could still hide but would soon make denial impossible. Her breasts had swelled tender and heavy. Her waist thickened despite the nausea that still plagued morning hours and made eating a challenge she met with grim determination. She had purchased a corset designed for expectant mothers from Mrs. Chen, the boarding house owner who had proven unexpectedly kind about Grace's situation, despite running an establishment that depended on maintaining respectable reputation. The orphan school occupied a converted warehouse at the edge of Pine Creek's small commercial district, housing 30 children ranging from infants to teenagers whose parents had succumbed to the various deaths that frontier life offered with generous frequency. Accident and disease, violence and simple disappearance, all the ways people could vanish and leave children behind to be absorbed by whatever institutions existed to prevent their complete abandonment. Grace taught reading and arithmetic to the older children, helped the matrons with infant care, scrubbed floors and washed linens, and performed all the labor that came with maintaining an institution chronically short of funds and workers. The pay was minimal, barely enough to cover her boarding house room and basic necessities, but it came with the promise that when her pregnancy became too advanced for other work, they would keep her on in exchange for room and board until 6 weeks after the birth. After that, she would need to find new arrangements. A child required more resources than a single woman's wages could provide, and Grace had begun making inquiries about families who might be willing to adopt an infant whose mother could not afford to keep it. The thought of giving up the baby made her physically ill in ways that had nothing to do with pregnancy nausea, but practical considerations could not be ignored simply because they caused emotional pain. She had no family, no husband, no resources beyond what her own labor could generate. Keeping a child meant condemning both of them to poverty that would grind away at health and opportunity until early death or permanent diminishment became inevitable outcomes. Some nights, Grace lay in her narrow bed with hands on her growing stomach and tried to imagine giving this child to strangers who would raise it without knowing anything about its origins or the circumstances of its conception. She tried to imagine walking away from the only piece of Nathaniel Cross she would ever possess, the only evidence that what they had felt for each other had been real, even if it proved insufficient to survive testing. She could not complete the imaginings. Her mind shied away from futures too painful to examine closely, and she told herself she had months yet before final decisions required making. Months to save more money, find better employment, perhaps discover some third option between keeping the child in poverty and surrendering it to unknowable futures. Letters from Beth Morrison arrived weekly, filled with encouragement and practical advice about navigating pregnancy alone and finding work in San Francisco once Grace felt ready to complete the journey west. Beth had established herself as assistant principal at a school for minors children, had married a carpenter named Thomas, who seemed decent if unexciting, had built a life that included modest comfort and the satisfaction of work that mattered. Her letter spoke of possibility and second chances, of women who had survived scandal and rebuilt respectability through perseverance, and the kind of quiet courage that came from refusing to accept that mistakes or misfortune had to define entire futures. Grace read these letters until the paper grew soft from handling, finding in Beth's words a lifeline to hope when despair threatened to overwhelm her completely. But she had not told Beth about the pregnancy, could not bring herself to write those words and make the situation real in ways that remained theoretical while confined to her own knowledge and the doctor's professional discretion. The omission felt like cowardice, but Grace told herself she would reveal everything once she had made decisions about the child's future and could present Beth with conclusions rather than questions she had no answers for. Crossridge felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. Pine Creek sat only 2 days' travel from the settlement, and Grace lived in constant fear that someone would arrive bearing news or questions, or worst of all, Nathaniel himself coming to demand explanations she could not provide without revealing the pregnancy she had chosen to conceal. But weeks passed without any contact from the mountain settlement. The silence should have brought relief. Instead, it confirmed what Grace had suspected the night she left. Nathaniel's love, if it had ever been real, was not strong enough to pursue when pursuit required overcoming obstacles and risking further damage to reputation already strained by scandal. She told herself she was better off without a man whose courage failed when tested. Told herself the child deserved better than a father who chose silence over defense of the woman he claimed to love. Told herself these things in the darkness before sleep claimed her, and almost believed them until dawn brought new day and the hollow ache in her chest that no amount of self-convincing could eliminate. The orphan school's director was a woman named Constance Mercer, 50 years old and hardened by decades of frontier life that had taken 3 husbands and left her with the grim determination of someone who had survived enough tragedy to understand that survival itself constituted victory, regardless of what comforts remained absent. She had hired Grace despite obvious questions about her background and circumstances, asking only that she work honestly and treat the children with the dignity too often denied those living on society's margins. Grace threw herself into the work with intensity that bordered on desperation, finding in the children's needs distraction from her own spiraling thoughts about futures that grew more complicated with each week of advancing pregnancy. She taught reading by having older children read aloud to younger ones, creating chains of learning that multiplied her effectiveness and gave the students pride in their growing capabilities. She organized the orphanage's small library, cataloging books donated by churches and charitable organizations, creating a system that allowed children to find stories that might transport them temporarily beyond the institutional walls that contained their daily existence. The children responded to her attention with the hungry eagerness of creatures starved for individual recognition in an environment that necessarily treated them as collective responsibility rather than unique persons deserving specialized care. They followed Grace through her daily routines, competed for her approval, brought her their small triumphs and disasters with the faith that she would acknowledge both with appropriate attention. It was one of these children, a girl named Lily, who reminded Grace painfully of Carrie with her solemn blue eyes and careful way of moving through space as if afraid to take up too much room, who first noticed Grace's changing body and asked the question that would alter everything. "Miss Hartley, are you going to have a baby?" The other children stopped their activities, attention focusing on Grace with the sharp interest children bring to adult secrets they sense but cannot fully understand. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced her voice to remain steady. "Yes, Lily, I am expecting a child." The admission hung in the air like smoke, visible evidence of what Grace had been trying to hide through careful clothing choices and strategic positioning. Lily's face brightened with curiosity that held no judgment, only the natural interest of a 10-year-old learning that her teacher participated in the mysterious adult world of reproduction and family creation. "Where's the baby's papa?" The question cut deeper than Lily could know. Grace chose her words carefully, aware that whatever she said would spread through the orphanage within hours and likely reach the broader Pine Creek community shortly afterward. "The baby's father is not part of our lives. It will be just the baby and me." Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense, her own experience of family fractured by loss, making solo parenthood seem unremarkable rather than scandalous. "That's all right. Lots of people here only have one parent or no parents. The baby will still be lucky to have you." The simple acceptance from a child who had lost everything made Grace's throat tighten with emotion she could not safely express. She nodded and redirected attention back to the lessons, but the conversation had opened doors that could not be closed again. By evening, Constance Mercer summoned Grace to her small office at the back of the converted warehouse. The director sat behind a desk piled with correspondence and account books, her expression unreadable as Grace entered and stood waiting for whatever judgment or consequence her revealed condition would provoke. "Sit down, Grace. We need to discuss your situation openly." Grace settled into the wooden chair facing the desk, folding her hands in her lap and preparing for dismissal. Constance studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I suspected pregnancy weeks ago. The signs are difficult to hide from someone who's birthed 6 children and buried 3 before they reached their second birthdays." The revelation that Grace's condition had been obvious to experienced eyes brought embarrassment mixed with relief that pretense could finally end. "I know unmarried pregnancy violates the moral standards most institutions maintain. I'll understand if you need to terminate my employment." Constance's expression softened in ways Grace had not seen during their previous interactions. "I'm not going to dismiss you. This orphanage exists because women and children find themselves in impossible situations through circumstances often beyond their control. I'd be a hypocrite to turn away a pregnant woman while claiming to serve those society has rejected." Grace's eyes stung with tears she had been holding back for weeks, maybe months. The unexpected kindness felt more devastating than judgment would have, breaking through defenses built from necessity and grim determination. "Thank you. I promise I'll work until the pregnancy makes it impossible, and I'll find other arrangements before I become a burden to the institution." Constance leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Grace's face. "Where is the child's father? Does he know about the pregnancy?" Grace shook her head, unwilling to speak the full truth about Nathaniel and Cross Ridge and all the complex reasons she had chosen to keep the pregnancy hidden from the one person who had the most right to know. "He doesn't know, and I don't intend to tell him. We parted badly, and informing him now would only create complications that benefit no one." Constance's expressions suggested she had heard similar stories before and understood the calculations that led women to choose silence over revelation, when revelation promised only additional suffering. "That's your decision to make, but I'll tell you plainly that raising a child alone is harder than you can imagine until you're living it. If there's any chance the father might provide support, you should consider accepting it regardless of pride or anger about how your relationship ended." The advice was sound, but it assumed facts not in evidence. Grace had no certainty Nathaniel would accept responsibility for a child he had not knowingly fathered. No guarantee he would believe her claim that the baby was his when the circumstances of conception remained mysterious even to Grace herself. Better to raise the child alone than risk rejection or accusations of attempting to trap a wealthy man through fabricated paternity. I appreciate your concern, but I've made my decision. The child and I will manage without the father's involvement. Constance nodded acceptance of Grace's position, if not agreement with its wisdom. Very well, but know that if circumstances change or you reconsider, my offer to help you contact the father stands. Grace departed the office with emotions churning between relief and renewed anxiety. Her pregnancy was now openly acknowledged, which meant the Pine Creek community would soon know and judge according to whatever standards govern their collective response to unmarried mothers. Some would condemn, others might sympathize, but all would note her condition and factor it into their assessment of her character and fitness for continued employment once the child arrived. The following Sunday, Grace attended services at the small Methodist church that served Pine Creek's spiritual needs. She had been sporadic in her attendance since arriving, her relationship with faith complicated by the way religious communities often wielded judgment like weapons against those whose lives deviated from prescribed paths. But something in her craved the ritual and community, the sense of connection to traditions larger than individual failure. Reverend Thomas Fletcher presided over the congregation with a gentle authority that seemed at odds with the fierce sermons Grace had grown accustomed to in Philadelphia's more formal churches. He was perhaps 45, widowed 5 years earlier when his wife had died during their third child's birth. He had raised the children alone while maintaining his ministry, and his sermons carried the practical wisdom of someone who understood that faith must accommodate messy reality rather than demanding reality conform to idealized versions of how life should unfold. After the service, he approached Grace as she prepared to depart. "Miss Hartley, might I have a word?" Grace's stomach clenched with anticipation of confrontation or unwelcome advice about her condition. But she nodded and followed him to the small garden behind the church where congregants sometimes gathered for fellowship after services concluded. Fletcher's expression held concern rather than judgment when he began speaking. "I understand from Mrs. Mercer that you are expecting a child without benefit of husband. I wanted to offer my support in the church's resources if you need assistance navigating your situation." The genuine kindness in his voice made Grace's defenses waver. "That's very generous, Reverend Fletcher. I appreciate your concern." He studied her face with the careful attention of someone trained to read emotional states beneath surface presentations. "Forgive my directness, but have you considered what you'll do after the child is born? Single motherhood presents significant challenges, particularly in communities that maintain traditional views about proper family structures." Grace had considered little else for weeks, though her considerations had produced more anxiety than actionable plans. "I'm exploring options. Mrs. Mercer has been kind enough to offer continued room and board for a period after the birth, which gives me time to find more permanent arrangements." Fletcher nodded slowly, seeming to gather courage for whatever he intended to say next. "I want to propose an alternative that might address both your needs and my own. I've been seeking a mother for my children since my wife's death 5 years ago. They need stability and feminine guidance that I cannot provide despite my best efforts. You need security for yourself and your coming child." The implication took a moment to register, and when it did, Grace felt the world tilt slightly off its usual axis. "Are you proposing marriage, Reverend Fletcher?" His smile was kind, but held no romantic warmth, simply the practical consideration of someone solving logistical problems through arrangement rather than passion. "I am. Not a love match, certainly, but a partnership that could benefit everyone involved. You would have a home and respectability. Your child would have a father's name in legitimate status. My children would have a mother who clearly possesses both education and genuine care for young people." The offer was so unexpected that Grace could not immediately formulate response. Marriage to a man she barely knew, to provide cover for a pregnancy conceived in circumstances she could not explain even to herself. It felt like capitulation to everything she had been fleeing since leaving Philadelphia. A return to arrangements based on convenience rather than genuine connection. But it also represented safety in a world that offered precious little security to women in her position. a name for the child, a home that did not depend on her continued employment or charitable tolerance from strangers. The possibility of building something resembling normal life, even if it lacked the passion she had briefly believed possible with Nathaniel. I don't know what to say, Reverend Fletcher. Your offer is generous beyond anything I expected, but I can't in good conscience accept without being honest about my reservations. Fletcher's expression remained patient, suggesting he had anticipated reluctance. I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Take time to consider the practical realities of your situation. If you decide my offer has merit, we can discuss details and expectations. If you determine you'd rather face the challenges alone, I'll respect your decision and offer whatever support the church can provide. Grace nodded, her mind already beginning the calculations that would occupy her thoughts for days to come. Fletcher departed after ensuring she knew how to contact him if she wished to continue the conversation, leaving Grace alone in the garden with questions that multiplied faster than she could formulate answers. Marriage to a man she did not love, security purchased through deception about the child's paternity, a life built on foundations of practicality rather than passion. Everything in her recoiled from the prospect, remembering the electric connection she had felt with Nathaniel and understanding that accepting Fletcher's offer meant abandoning hope that what she and Nathaniel had shared might somehow be salvaged or replicated. But hope was a luxury Grace could no longer afford. She had a child to consider now, a life that depended on her making choices based on survival, rather than romantic ideals that had already proven themselves too fragile to withstand reality's testing. She walked back to the boarding house through afternoon heat that made her loose dress cling to damp skin, and the child moved restlessly in her womb as if protesting the temperature, or perhaps sensing its mother's agitation. By the time she reached her small room, Grace had made no decision except to delay deciding until circumstances forced resolution one direction or another. At Cross Ridge, the settlement moved through August with the mechanical efficiency of an operation that could function without emotional investment from its nominal owner. Jake Porter managed timber operations, Mrs. Porter maintained the household, and Judith presided over the children with rigid discipline that had intensified since Grace's departure, as if compensating for the softness that had briefly infiltrated the strict routine she preferred. Nathaniel existed rather than lived, performing the minimal functions required to keep his business relationships intact, while his interior landscape grew increasingly barren. He stopped visiting Elena's grave, the ritual that had sustained him through the first year after her death, now feeling hollow compared to the fresh grief of losing Grace. He had not known it was possible to mourn someone still living, but the ache in his chest felt identical to what Elena's death had carved into him, the same sense of irretrievable loss and opportunity squandered through cowardice or poor judgment. He had replayed the charity event hundreds of times in his mind, examining each moment where he might have chosen differently and changed outcomes that felt increasingly inevitable in retrospect. He should have defended Grace immediately when Major Whitmore began revealing her background, should have stood before the assembled society and declared that her father's crimes had no bearing on her character or his estimation of her worth, should have claimed her publicly and damned the social consequences that seemed so much less important now than they had in the moment when choosing required courage he had not yet gathered. Instead, he had hesitated, calculated costs, allowed silence to speak the condemnation that words had not quite articulated. And Grace had understood his silence correctly as choosing propriety over passion, protecting Cross Ridge's reputation at the expense of defending the woman who had brought life back to his household and hope back to his devastated children. Carrie had not spoken since Grace's departure, retreating into the silence she had inhabited before the teacher's arrival, as if the brief months of recovery had been dream rather than reality. She sat by her window staring at nothing, refusing food and comfort with equal determination, slowly fading in ways that terrified Nathaniel with their echoes of how Elena had withdrawn before choosing death as her only exit from unbearable existence. Ben had returned to hiding under furniture and starting at sudden noises, his brief emergence into childhood's normal exuberance collapsing back into the defensive crouch of someone who had learned too well that people you loved could vanish without warning or explanation. Jake found Nathaniel in his study one evening in mid-August, staring at paperwork he had made no attempt to complete, despite hours sitting motionless at his desk. The children are asking for her again, Carrie especially. She's not eating enough to sustain a bird, and if this continues much longer, we'll need to consider more serious interventions. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists on the desk surface, knuckles whitening with pressure. What would you have me do, Jake? Drag Grace back against her will? Force her to return to a household where my sister-in-law orchestrated her public humiliation and I stood silent while it happened? Jake's weathered face remained impassive, but his tone carried the bluntness of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly through decades of loyal service. I'd have you go find her and apologize for being a coward. Tell her you love her and beg forgiveness for failing to defend her when defense mattered. See if maybe she's willing to give you another chance to be the man she deserves rather than the one you were that night in Denver. The words landed like physical blows, accurate enough to wound because they articulated what Nathaniel had been thinking, but lacked courage to act upon. What if she refuses? What if the damage is too great to repair? Jake shrugged with the pragmatism of someone who understood that some questions could only be answered through trying rather than speculation. Then you'll know you tried and failed rather than failing without trying. Seems to me the latter is what's eating you alive right now, and it's killing your children in the process. The assessment was harsh but undeniable. Nathaniel had been slowly disappearing into self-recrimination and regret, and his withdrawal was devastating Carrie and Ben as thoroughly as Grace's absence had initially shocked them. They were losing both the woman who had become their maternal figure and the father who had checked out emotionally in response to guilt and grief he could not process constructively. Where would I even begin looking? Pine Creek is the closest settlement, but she could have continued anywhere from there. California, Oregon, back east to Philadelphia for all I know. Jake pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and placed it on the desk. Mrs. Porter has a cousin in Pine Creek who writes regular letters. Most recent one mentioned a new teacher at the orphanage, young woman with brown hair and education beyond what frontier settlements usually see. Could be coincidence, but seems worth investigating before you convince yourself she's disappeared beyond finding. Nathaniel picked up the letter and read the brief paragraph describing the orphanage's new teacher who had arrived in early June and impressed everyone with her dedication despite appearing to carry some private sorrow that occasionally showed in unguarded moments. The description fit Grace, but it could also fit dozens of other educated women who found themselves teaching in frontier institutions after circumstances reduced their options to whatever work they could find. I'll go to Pine Creek tomorrow. Today if I can arrange it. The decision brought something that felt almost like relief, the prospect of action after weeks of paralysis. But if she refuses to see me, if she's built a new life and wants no part of Cross Ridge or me, I'll respect that and find other ways to help the children recover. Jake nodded approval and departed, leaving Nathaniel alone with plans forming in his mind and hope building cautiously in his chest, despite every reason to expect that Grace would reject any approach from the man who had betrayed her through silence. He spent the remainder of the evening preparing for the journey, writing instructions for Jake about managing operations during his absence, and composing a letter to Judith informing her he was leaving, and she should not expect explanations or updates until he returned. He did not tell her where he was going or why, unwilling to give her opportunity to interfere or plant obstacles that might prevent him from attempting the apology and reconciliation he should have pursued weeks earlier. The following morning, Nathaniel rode out before dawn, pushing his horse hard down the mountain road toward Pine Creek, while the settlement still slept, and no one could delay his departure with questions or demands. The journey that usually took 2 days he completed in one through sheer determination and willingness to sacrifice comfort for speed. He reached Pine Creek as evening shadows stretched across the dusty main street, his horse lathered and exhausted from the punishing pace. After settling the animal at the livery with instructions for proper care and rest, Nathaniel made his way to the boarding house Mrs. Porter's letter had mentioned as the probable location where a new teacher might secure lodging. Mrs. Chen confirmed that Miss Hartley rented a room and could likely be found at the orphanage where she worked most days until evening. Nathaniel thanked her and turned toward the converted warehouse at the edge of town, his heart hammering with anticipation and fear in equal measure. He found Grace in the orphanage's small courtyard, reading aloud to a group of children seated on benches in the fading daylight. Her voice carried the same gentle cadence he remembered from Cross Ridge, and the children listened with the rapt attention of those who had been given the gift of someone's complete focus and care. She looked different than she had 8 weeks ago, thinner in the face despite the loose dress that suggested her body had changed in ways the fabric was designed to conceal. Older somehow, as if the weeks since Denver had added years rather than mere months to features that had seemed so young when she first arrived at Cross Ridge. Grace finished the chapter and closed the book, preparing to dismiss the children for their evening meal. Then her gaze lifted and locked on Nathaniel standing at the courtyard entrance, and every emotion she had been controlling for weeks flashed across her face in rapid succession. Shock, pain, anger. And beneath it all, something that might have been hope if he was not reading his own desperate wishes into her expression. She stood slowly, gesturing for one of the older children to take the younger ones inside. When they were alone in the courtyard with evening settling around them, like witness to whatever confrontation or reconciliation might follow, Grace spoke with the careful control of someone managing strong emotion through sheer will. "What are you doing here, Nathaniel?" He moved closer but stopped several feet away, respecting the distance she maintained like physical barrier between them. "I came to apologize, to beg your forgiveness for being a coward when you needed me to be brave. To tell you that I love you and I was wrong to let you leave without fighting for you the way you deserved." Grace's hands trembled as she set the book on the bench, her voice emerging rough with suppressed tears. "Your apology comes 8 weeks too late. I needed you that night in Denver, and you calculated the cost of defending me and found it too high. That choice revealed everything I needed to know about what I meant to you when measured against social standing and business relationships." The accusation was fair but incomplete, and Nathaniel rushed to fill in the gaps his silence had created. "You meant everything. You still mean everything. I was terrified of losing the children's futures and Cross Ridge's viability. But more than that, I was terrified of loving someone again and watching them destroy themselves the way Elena did. I was paralyzed by fear of repetition, of making the same mistakes and ending up with the same devastating results." Grace's expression softened slightly, some of the anger bleeding into weary understanding. "I'm not Elena. I would never punish you or the children for my own unhappiness by choosing death as escape. But your fear of repetition blinded you to who I actually am versus the ghost you were afraid I might become." Nathaniel closed the remaining distance between them, his hands rising to frame her face with a gentleness that contradicted the desperation driving his words. "I know that now. I should have known it then. But grief makes fools of us all, and I've been a fool longer than most. Grace, please, give me another chance to prove I can be the man you deserve. Come back to Cross Ridge. The children are falling apart without you. Carrie stopped eating, Ben's hiding again, and I can't breathe properly, knowing you're out here building a life that doesn't include us." Grace's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled over, tracking down her cheeks as she raised her own hands to cover his, where they rested against her face. "I can't come back, Nathaniel. Too much has changed. I've changed. The person you knew at Cross Ridge doesn't exist anymore, and the person I'm becoming needs different things than what you're offering." He started to protest, but she stopped him by placing her fingers against his lips. "Let me finish. I need to tell you something, and depending on how you react, it will determine whether we have any future together or if we part here permanently." Nathaniel's stomach clenched with dread at the seriousness in her tone, but he nodded acceptance and waited for whatever revelation would either build bridge between them or confirm that the chasm created in Denver had grown too wide to span. Grace stepped back, her hands falling to her sides and then moving almost unconsciously to rest on her abdomen in a gesture that stopped Nathaniel's breath in his throat. "I'm pregnant, 14 weeks. I don't know how it happened because we didn't consummate anything. But the child is yours regardless of how impossible that seems." The words hung between them like explosive charges waiting for ignition. Nathaniel's mind raced through possibilities. Memories of the night they had cared for Carrie together flickering through awareness with new significance. The wine. At dinner before the charity event. Judith poured the wine and you seemed unusually tired afterward. Disoriented, and memory surfaced with sickening clarity. He had woken in his own bed the morning after with no recollection of retiring there, his clothes disheveled, and a lingering headache that suggested he had consumed more alcohol than he remembered. Grace's face had gone pale, understanding dawning in her eyes as the same terrible suspicion took root. "You think Judith drugged us? Arranged for us to, while we were unconscious or too impaired to remember?" Nathaniel felt rage building in his chest, cold and absolute. It would explain everything. The pregnancy, the lack of memory, her satisfaction when reading your letter at the charity event. She created the scandal she needed to destroy your position and eliminate you as a threat. Grace sank onto the bench, her hands still pressed against her stomach where the child grew. Unknowing participant in machinations that had shaped its existence. That's monstrous. Even for someone as calculating as Judith, to drug two people and orchestrate conception for the purpose of later using the pregnancy as weapon seems beyond. She stopped, recognizing even as she spoke that Judith's obsessive love for Nathaniel had already demonstrated capacity for extreme measures. Reading private letters and engineering public humiliation were merely steps along a continuum that could absolutely include the violation Grace was now suspecting. Nathaniel knelt before her, his hands covering hers where they rested on the small swell of her belly. "I don't care how it happened. This child is ours, and I want to be part of its life and yours. Marry me, Grace. Come back to Cross Ridge as my wife, and we'll face Judith together and build the family we should have been creating all along." Grace's tears flowed freely now, and she shook her head even as her fingers laced through his. "I can't marry you as recompense for pregnancy or out of obligation to give the child your name. If we marry, it has to be because you love me enough to choose me over every obstacle and every consequence, not because circumstances have forced a solution that seems practically necessary." Nathaniel pulled her down to meet his kiss, pouring into the contact everything he had failed to say in Denver and every day since. The kiss tasted of salt and desperation and the kind of hope that comes when people balanced on edges decide to either leap together or fall separately. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and clinging to each other like survivors of shipwrecks finding solid ground, Nathaniel spoke with absolute certainty. "I choose you, Grace Hartley, not because of the child, though I'm grateful beyond words for that gift. Not because Carrie and Ben need you, though they do desperately. I choose you because you brought life back to a place marked by death, because you saw me at my worst and still believed I could be better. I choose you because I love you, and I'm finally ready to fight for that love the way I should have done from the beginning." Grace searched his face, looking for doubt or reservation and finding only fierce determination mixed with love so naked it made her breath catch. "Then yes, I'll marry you and return to Cross Ridge and face whatever Judith or society throws at us. But I won't pretend the child is conceived innocently. I want her investigated, held accountable if our suspicions prove correct." Nathaniel nodded grimly, already planning the confrontations that would need to happen before Grace could safely return to a household where Judith still held power. "We'll handle Judith together. But first I need to tell you about Major Whitmore's investigation." Grace's expression shifted to apprehension at the Major's name. "What investigation?" Nathaniel helped her to her feet, keeping her hand clasped in his while he explained what he had learned from the Major's visit to Cross Ridge 2 weeks after the charity event. "Whitmore felt guilty about his role in your public humiliation. He conducted a thorough investigation into Elena's death, interviewing doctors and servants and reviewing medical records from her treatment for melancholy after Ben's birth." He paused, gathering strength to say aloud what he had been processing privately for weeks. "Elena had a history of depressive illness that predated our marriage. Her family concealed it because mental instability carried social stigma that could prevent advantageous matches. The isolation of Cross Ridge and the hormonal changes from pregnancy combined with pre-existing condition to create crisis her treatments couldn't manage." Grace's hand tightened on his, offering comfort for revelations that must have cost him deeply. "Major Whitmore concluded I bore no blame for her death beyond the universal guilt that comes from loving someone we cannot save from themselves. He apologized for doubting me and for participating in the events that drove you away." The information settled between them, recontextualizing Nathaniel's grief and Grace's understanding of the household she had briefly been part of. I'm sorry you carried that guilt alone for so long, believing yourself responsible for tragedy that had roots far deeper than any single person's actions. Nathaniel pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the small swell of her belly pressed against him where their child grew despite impossible circumstances. I'm done carrying burdens alone. From now on, we face everything together. They stood in the darkening courtyard making plans and promises. Two people who had found each other against odds that should have kept them separate, choosing to build future from the wreckage of separate pasts that had brought them to this moment of decision. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to Cross Ridge. Tomorrow they would confront Judith and demand answers about the night that had resulted in Grace's pregnancy. Tomorrow they would tell Carrie and Ben that Mama Grace was returning permanently, bringing with her a baby who would be their sibling and evidence that life could surprise you with gifts even in the midst of grief. But tonight they simply held each other while stars emerged overhead and the orphan children settled into sleep behind walls that had temporarily sheltered Grace, but could no longer contain the expanding future she was choosing with Nathaniel, despite every practical reason to protect herself through continued separation. Love was not practical. Grace understood that now in ways she had not grasped when she first arrived at Cross Ridge, seeking purpose and finding something far more complicated and precious. Love was risk and vulnerability, and choosing to stay present even when staying meant facing pain alongside joy. Love was Nathaniel riding 2 days to find her and Grace saying yes, despite legitimate fears about what returning might cost. They would face those costs together. And if that meant confronting Judith and weathering more scandal and building family from components that did not fit traditional templates, then they would do so with the stubborn determination of people who had already survived worse and discovered that survival mattered less than what you chose to survive for. Grace felt the child move in her womb, a flutter that was becoming more distinct each day as the pregnancy progressed. She placed Nathaniel's hand over the spot, wanting him to feel the life they had created, even if creation had come through violation rather than choice. There, did you feel that? His face transformed with wonder, and for the first time since Elena's death, Grace saw Nathaniel Cross smile with unguarded joy. I felt it, our child already making its presence known. Grace leaned against him, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming as adrenaline drained away and left her boneless with relief and the tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could navigate the challenges ahead and build something worthy of the love that had survived testing and emerged stronger for having been broken and reformed. But even as they held each other in the gathering darkness, neither yet knew about the storm approaching from Cross Ridge, where Carrie Cross had made a decision that would force events to accelerate beyond anyone's capacity to control their trajectory. The return journey to Cross Ridge took 3 days instead of the usual 2, Nathaniel unwilling to push Grace in her condition despite her insistence that she could manage the pace. They stopped frequently, and he watched her with the careful attention of someone who had already lost too much and would not risk further tragedy through impatience or neglect. She found his protectiveness both touching and occasionally frustrating, but mostly she was grateful to have someone who cared enough to worry about her welfare after months of navigating pregnancy's challenges alone. They had married in Pine Creek before departing, a brief ceremony performed by Reverend Fletcher, who had accepted the change in circumstances with grace that spoke to genuine character rather than wounded pride. He had blessed their union with words about second chances and the mysterious ways Providence worked to bring people together despite obstacles that seemed insurmountable. And Grace had felt the truth of his observations settle into her bones like warmth after long exposure to cold. Mrs. Chen had served as witness, along with Constance Mercer, who had given Grace a fierce hug and whispered that she was proud to see her choosing love over fear. The orphan children had showered them with wildflowers gathered from the surrounding plains, and Grace had wept at the gesture's sweetness and the reminder of the garden she had tended at Cross Ridge that had started everything spiraling toward this improbable conclusion. She was Grace Cross now, carrying that name and all its weight of history and expectation. The marriage certificate rested in her traveling bag alongside the few possessions she had accumulated during her exile from the mountain settlement that was about to become her permanent home. Permanent, assuming Judith's reaction did not prove violent enough to make continued residence impossible. Nathaniel had sent Jake Porter ahead with a letter informing the settlement of his return with his new wife, deliberately omitting details about her identity to prevent Judith from preparing defensive strategies before they could confront her directly about the drugging and its consequences. Jake would have delivered the message yesterday, which meant the household had 24 hours to speculate and gossip before the truth arrived in flesh rather than rumor. They crested the final ridge overlooking Cross Ridge as afternoon sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber. The settlement looked unchanged from Grace's memory. The same weathered buildings clustered around the main house, the same pines rising like sentinels on three sides, the same sense of being perched at the edge of wilderness where civilization's hold remained tenuous, despite human efforts to impose order on chaos. But something felt different as they descended the final slope toward the main clearing. Too quiet, even accounting for the late September afternoon when most workers would be occupied with harvest preparations and the urgent tasks that preceded winter's return to the high country. Jake Porter met them at the settlement entrance, his weathered face carrying an expression Grace had not seen before, something between relief and alarm that made her stomach clench with apprehension. "Thank God you're here. Carrie's gone missing, disappeared sometime early this morning. We've searched the settlement and the nearby trails but found no sign." Nathaniel was off his horse before Jake finished speaking, his face draining of color. "How long has she been gone? Has anyone checked the old trapper's cabin? The garden area?" Jake nodded, his hands twisted together in unconscious distress. "First place we looked, nothing. Ben says she left before dawn, took her warmest cloak and a bag with some bread and the carved horse Miss Grace gave him. He found this on her bed." He produced a folded paper covered in Carrie's careful handwriting. Nathaniel opened it with trembling fingers, and Grace read over his shoulder the words that made her heart lurch with equal parts love and terror. "Papa, I heard Mrs. Porter talking about how you went to find Mama Grace. I'm going to find her too and bring her home because Ben and me need her and you need her, and if you're too scared to tell her that, then I have to do it myself. I remember the way to Pine Creek from when we went to Denver. I'll be careful. Please don't be angry. I love you. Carrie." Grace's hand flew to her mouth, horror washing through her at the image of a 9-year-old child walking alone through mountain wilderness on a journey that took adults 2 days with horses and knowledge of the territory. "She's been gone since dawn? That's 10 hours, maybe 12. She could be 15 miles down the trail by now, or lost and wandering in circles, or—" Nathaniel's face had gone grim with the same calculations, all the terrible possibilities that mountain country presented to children traveling alone without adequate supplies or understanding of the dangers that inhabited the forests and high meadows between settlements. Organize search parties. Send riders down the main trail and teams to check the side paths where a child might wander if she lost her way. I'll take the northern route in case she remembered incorrectly and headed toward the old mining camps instead of Pine Creek. Grace was already dismounting, ignoring Nathaniel's protest. "I'm coming with you. If we find her, she'll need to see me immediately to know the journey was unnecessary because I'm already here." They wasted no time arguing, both understanding that every minute spent in debate was a minute Carrie remained lost and potentially in danger from exposure or the early season storms that could blow in without warning and drop temperatures to levels that killed unprepared travelers. The search consumed the remainder of daylight and stretched into evening as teams fanned out across the mountainside calling Carrie's name into forests that swallowed sound and returned only silence. Grace rode beside Nathaniel along the main trail to Pine Creek, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of a small figure in a dark cloak, any evidence that Carrie had passed this way. They found the first sign 3 hours down the trail, the carved wooden horse lying beside the path as if deliberately placed to mark Carrie's passage. Nathaniel dismounted and picked it up with shaking hands. "She's been here, recently enough that the wood hasn't weathered. She must have dropped it or set it down to rest." Grace's throat tightened with emotion at the evidence that Carrie had been carrying the toy Ben treasured, taking it as talisman, or perhaps intending to return it to Grace as gesture of connection between the family members she was trying to reunite. They pushed forward with renewed urgency, following the trail as it wound through stands of aspen, already losing leaves to approaching autumn and meadows where frost had killed the last wildflowers. The temperature dropped as full darkness arrived, and Grace began to shiver despite her heavy coat, worry for Carrie intensifying with each degree the mercury fell. Near midnight they heard it, a small sound that might have been wind in the branches or might have been a child's voice carried on air currents. Nathaniel called out immediately, his voice echoing across the valley. "Carrie, if you can hear me, call back." Silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Then, faint but unmistakable, a response. "Papa, Papa, I'm here." They found her huddled beneath an overhang of rock, where she had taken shelter as darkness made continuing impossible and cold made staying in the open dangerous. She was shivering violently, her cloak wrapped tight but inadequate against temperatures that had fallen below freezing. When Nathaniel pulled her from the shelter, she collapsed against him, too cold and exhausted to stand without support. Grace dismounted and wrapped Carrie in her own cloak, layering warmth over the child's chilled body, while Nathaniel held them both and made sounds that might have been prayers or curses, or simply the inarticulate relief of a parent who had imagined the worst and been spared its realization. "Mama Grace," Carrie's teeth chattered so hard she could barely form words. "I was coming to find you, to bring you home. Papa needs you, and Ben needs you, and I need you, and you can't stay away because we're a family." Grace pressed her face against Carrie's cold hair, her own tears freezing on her cheeks in the bitter air. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm not going away again. I married your papa, and we're all going to be together from now on." Carrie pulled back just enough to see Grace's face in the moonlight that had broken through clouds, her eyes wide despite exhaustion. "You married Papa? You're really our mama now, not just Mama Grace who might leave?" Nathaniel gathered them both close, his voice rough with emotion. "She's really your mama now, and we're going to have a baby too, which means you'll be a big sister." The information should probably have waited for warmth and safety, but Grace understood Nathaniel's need to cement their new reality with declarations that left no room for doubt or future separation. Carrie's face transformed despite the cold, joy breaking through the exhaustion like sun through storm clouds. "A baby. I'm going to have a real baby brother or sister?" Grace nodded, guiding Carrie's small hand to rest on the swell of her belly where the child could feel the evidence of the pregnancy. "Due in February, just in time for you to help teach the baby all about Cross Ridge and mountain living." They wrapped Carrie in every available layer of clothing and began the journey back to the settlement, Nathaniel carrying his daughter before him on the horse, while Grace followed close behind. The child fell asleep almost immediately, her body's desperate need for rest overwhelming the excitement of reunion and revelations. They reached Cross Ridge near dawn, the settlement beginning to stir as search parties returned with relief at news that Carrie had been found safe. Mrs. Porter had prepared hot water and warm blankets, and they settled Carrie in her bed with heated stones wrapped in cloth to restore circulation to limbs that had grown dangerously cold during her night exposed to mountain weather. Dr. Matthews arrived from Pine Creek, where Jake had summoned him the previous afternoon when Carrie's disappearance became known. He examined the child thoroughly, pronouncing her suffering from exhaustion and mild exposure, but likely to recover fully with rest and warmth in the attentive care already being provided. "She's a determined one, making that journey alone. Foolish, certainly, but the kind of foolishness that speaks to deep love and fierce loyalty. Those are qualities worth preserving, even as we teach her safer ways to express them." Grace sat beside Carrie's bed through the morning, watching the child sleep and processing the enormity of what had nearly happened. If they had not found her, if the temperatures had dropped lower, if she had fallen or become truly lost instead of finding shelter and waiting for rescue. The possibilities churned through Grace's mind like debris in floodwaters, each one carrying the weight of tragedy narrowly avoided. Judith appeared in the doorway as morning light strengthened, her face carefully composed, but eyes betraying emotions Grace could not quite parse. Anger, certainly, at the disruption of her carefully maintained household order. But beneath that, something else. Fear, perhaps, or the calculation of someone recognizing that power structures were shifting in ways she could no longer control. "I see you've returned, Miss Hartley. How enterprising of you to worm your way back into this household through Mr. Cross's temporary weakness and his daughter's ill-advised adventure." Nathaniel rose from where he had been sitting on Carrie's other side, his expression hardening into something Grace had not seen before. Absolute fury barely contained by the thinnest veneer of civilized behavior. "It's Mrs. Cross now, Judith. Grace and I were married in Pine Creek before returning. She is my wife and the children's stepmother, and you will address her with the respect those positions command." Judith's face went through several expressions in rapid succession before settling into the cold mask that characterized her most dangerous moods. "How convenient. Barely 2 months apart, and suddenly you have decided marriage to your former employee is appropriate, despite the scandal her background would bring to any respectable household." Grace stood, her own anger rising to meet Judith's, though she kept her voice level through sheer will. "The only scandal in this household is the one you created through drugging your brother-in-law and myself, arranging for us to be intimate while unconscious, and then using the resulting pregnancy as weapon to destroy my reputation and eliminate me as threat to your obsessive designs on Nathaniel." The accusation landed like artillery in the small room. Judith's face went white, then red, cycling through colors that suggested internal battle between denial and the terrible relief of having secrets finally exposed. "You have no proof of such monstrous allegations. The ravings of a desperate woman trying to explain away her own moral failures are hardly evidence of conspiracy." Nathaniel moved to stand beside Grace, presenting unified front against Judith's attempts to deflect through outrage. "We have the timeline that makes no sense otherwise. We have our mutual lack of memory of that night, despite both going to bed sober. We have your satisfied expression the following morning and your strategic deployment of Grace's private letter at the charity event. Perfect timing to maximize damage after you had already ensured her pregnancy would eventually become visible evidence of scandal." His voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. "Most damning of all, we have Major Whitmore's investigation into the wine served that evening. He became suspicious after the charity event concluded and had the remaining bottles tested. The laboratory found traces of laudanum in concentrations sufficient to induce unconsciousness and memory loss in anyone who consumed even a single glass." Judith's expression shifted from outrage to something approaching panic as she understood the full scope of what Nathaniel had uncovered during the weeks since Grace's departure. "The Major is mistaken, or you're lying about his findings. I would never. Such an action would be monstrous beyond anything I could contemplate." Grace stepped forward, her voice steady despite the rage churning in her chest. "You loved Nathaniel and believed you deserved him more than Elena did, more than I did. You waited years for your chance, and when I appeared and threatened your carefully laid plans, you took action to ensure my removal. The pregnancy was supposed to be discovered later, after you had already driven me away, serving as final proof of my moral corruption and unsuitability for any position in a respectable household." She paused, letting the weight of understanding settle. "But I left before you could orchestrate that revelation. And in leaving, I took away your triumph, leaving you with nothing but the hollow victory of having destroyed what you could not possess." Judith's face crumpled, the mask finally breaking to reveal the desperate woman beneath. Her voice emerged as whisper, all pretense abandoned. "I loved him first. Before Elena, before you, I loved Nathaniel Cross, and I believed that devotion and patience would eventually be rewarded. But he never saw me. Not as a woman, not as someone worthy of the love I had been offering for years." Tears streaked down her face, and for the first time Grace felt something approaching pity for this woman who had caused such devastation from wounds that had been festering far longer than Grace's own involvement with the household. "When Elena died, I thought finally it would be my turn. I made myself indispensable. I cared for those children and ran this household and waited for Nathaniel to understand that I was what he needed. But you arrived and within weeks accomplished what I could not achieve in years. You reached him, made him feel things I had never been able to inspire no matter how hard I tried." She looked at Grace with an expression that combined hatred and anguished recognition. "So yes, I drugged the wine. I arranged for you to be together while neither could refuse or remember. I thought if you became pregnant and I could expose you as having seduced your employer, Nathaniel would send you away and finally see that I was the woman who had stood faithfully beside him through every trial." The confession hung in the air like smoke from burning bridges. visible evidence of choices made and consequences that could not be avoided. Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his voice vibrating with controlled fury. You violated us both, created a child through assault, and then attempted to use that child as weapon against the woman I love and the family I'm trying to build. That level of betrayal goes beyond anything I can forgive or forget. Judith seemed to collapse inward, her rigid posture crumbling as the full weight of her actions and their exposure settled onto shoulders that could no longer bear the load. I know. I know what I've done is unforgivable. I've become the monster Elena always feared she was, the person who hurts others because her own pain has become too great to contain. She looked at Carrie sleeping in the bed, at Nathaniel standing beside Grace with his hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder, at the tableau of family she had tried to prevent and inadvertently helped create through her machinations. I'll leave Crossridge, today, immediately. You'll never have to see me again or worry that I might cause further damage to what you're building. Nathaniel shook his head, his expression grim. You'll leave, yes, but not before you face consequences beyond simple banishment. Major Whitmore has been informed of the laudanum findings and your likely involvement. He will want to question you about the assault and determine what legal actions are appropriate given the circumstances. Judith's face went gray with understanding that her confession had placed her in jeopardy beyond social disgrace. Drugging and sexual assault, even when motivated by obsessive love rather than malice, carried legal consequences that could include imprisonment or commitment to institutions designed for those whose mental states made them dangerous to themselves and others. I understand. I'll submit to whatever investigation or punishment is deemed appropriate. I no longer have strength to fight or resist. I'm tired of fighting, tired of loving without hope of return, tired of being the villain in a story where I once believed myself the heroine waiting for justice. She departed without further word, leaving Grace and Nathaniel alone with Carrie, sleeping between them, and the weight of revelations that had transformed understanding without providing easy resolution. Grace sat heavily on the edge of Carrie's bed, her hand resting on the child's shoulder, while emotions churned too complex to separate into individual components. Rage at the violation, relief that suspicions had been confirmed and Judith's actions exposed. Grief for a woman so consumed by unrequited love that she had destroyed herself in attempting to claim what had never been hers to take. What happens now? Her voice emerged quiet, barely above whisper. Nathaniel pulled a chair close and took her hand, lacing their fingers together with the careful attention of someone handling something precious and fragile. Now we heal. We build the family that Judith tried to prevent. We raise Carrie and Ben and this baby we created under terrible circumstances but who deserves to be loved regardless of how conception occurred. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. And we decide together what justice looks like for someone whose actions were monstrous but whose motivations came from pain rather than pure malice. Grace understood the question beneath his statement. Did they pursue legal action that would see Judith imprisoned or institutionalized? Or did they accept her exile and attempt to build future without dragging everyone through public trials that would expose intimate violations and cause further harm to children who had already endured more than their share of adult tragedy? I don't know. Part of me wants her punished for what she did, for the violation and the manipulation and the attempt to destroy our relationship before it could fully form. But another part recognizes that sending her to prison or asylum doesn't undo the harm and might actually perpetuate cycles of pain rather than breaking them. Nathaniel nodded slowly, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand while he processed the same complex calculations. Major Whitmore suggested a middle path. Judith could be placed in a private sanitarium that treats melancholy and obsessive conditions, not as punishment, but as genuine attempt to address the underlying issues that drove her actions. She would be removed from Crossridge and prevented from causing further harm, but also given opportunity for healing rather than mere containment. The proposal had merit, offering consequences without pure retribution, acknowledgement of harm without pretending that vengeance would restore what had been taken. Grace found herself nodding agreement before she had fully processed all implications. That seems just, more just than she deserves, perhaps, But justice tempered with mercy and recognition that hurt people, and breaking cycles requires choosing differently than our worst impulses demand. They sat in silence, broken only by Carrie's steady breathing and the sounds of the settlement coming to life beyond the windows. The crisis had passed, Carrie found safe, Judith exposed. The terrible secrets that had poisoned Cross Ridge's atmosphere finally dragged into light where they could be examined and perhaps eventually moved beyond. But Grace understood, with the clarity that comes after surviving storms, that this was not conclusion, but rather inflection point. The real work of building family from damaged components and creating home from space marked by loss and violation lay ahead, stretching into futures none of them could yet fully envision. 2 weeks passed in careful adjustment to new configurations. Judith departed for the sanitarium in Denver under Major Whitmore's escort, her departure marked by neither ceremony nor much discussion beyond the practical arrangements. The household exhaled as she left, tension that had been constant presence for months finally releasing to allow space for different emotional weather. Carrie recovered from her adventure with the resilience of children who have not yet learned that some risks carry consequences too permanent to heal from. She threw herself into preparations for the baby's arrival with an enthusiasm that sometimes overwhelmed Grace but mostly filled her with gratitude for a child who could still find joy despite everything life had already taught her about loss. Ben emerged from his hiding places permanently, his laughter becoming frequent music in hallways that had known too much silence. He followed Grace through her daily activities, chattering about rocks and birds and all the wonders he was discovering now that fear no longer governed his movements through the world. The wedding had been private, but Cross Ridge demanded celebration of Nathaniel's remarriage and Grace's permanent return. Jake and Mrs. Porter organized a gathering for late September, inviting the settlement families and a few close associates from Pine Creek in Denver, creating an occasion that would formalize Grace's position as mistress of Cross Ridge while acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had brought her to that role. Grace woke on the wedding celebration day to autumn sun streaming through windows, and Nathaniel beside her, his hand resting protectively on her belly, where their child grew larger each week. They had been sleeping together since her return, the physical intimacy now chosen rather than imposed. Mutual exploration of desire and connection that felt worlds different from the violation that had initiated the pregnancy, neither regretted despite how it had come to be. Nervous? His voice carried sleep roughness that made her smile. Terrified. All those people judging whether the former teacher is suitable mistress for Cross Ridge. Whether the scandal of my background and the pregnancy disqualifies me from respectable society despite legal marriage and your very public claim. Nathaniel pulled her closer, his lips finding the sensitive spot behind her ear that made her breath catch. Let them judge. We know the truth, and that's all that matters. Besides, anyone who dares criticize you to my hearing will quickly learn that I've discovered protective instincts I didn't know I possessed. The fierce declaration made her laugh despite her anxiety, and she turned in his arms to kiss him properly, losing herself in the connection that still felt new enough to be miraculous despite growing familiarity. They rose and dressed with care, Grace in a gown Mrs. Porter had altered to accommodate her expanding waistline while maintaining elegance appropriate to the occasion. Deep blue silk that brought out the green in her eyes, lace at collar and cuffs, her hair arranged in soft curls that framed her face and made her look younger than her 21 years. Nathaniel wore a dark suit that emphasized his height and the lean strength of a man whose work involved physical labor despite wealth that could have purchased idleness. Together they looked like what they were, a couple building life from components that did not fit traditional molds, but created something sturdy nonetheless. The celebration took place in the settlement's main hall, tables laden with food Mrs. Porter and the other women had been preparing for days. Guests began arriving mid-morning, and Grace found herself swept into conversations and introductions, her role as Nathaniel's wife providing shield against the worst curiosity while exposing her to the assessment of people who would become her community if she could successfully navigate the social complexities of her position. Major Whitmore arrived late morning, his presence causing brief tension until he made clear he had come to support the union rather than question it. He pulled Grace aside during a lull in the festivities, his expression serious, but lacking the judgment or she had feared. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Cross. My actions at the charity event contributed to pain that could have been avoided if I had investigated more thoroughly before making accusations public. Grace studied his face, seeing genuine remorse in features that had seemed so harsh during their previous encounters. You acted on information you believed accurate. I don't hold you responsible for Judith's manipulations any more than I hold myself responsible for being vulnerable to them. Whitmore nodded, but his expression suggested he was not quite ready to absolve himself so easily. Nevertheless, I want you to know that I've taken measures to ensure your father's scandal does not follow you into your new life. I have contacts in Philadelphia who owed me favors, and they've been persuaded to let sleeping dogs lie rather than continuing to pursue association between you and the Hartley banking collapse. The gift was unexpected and more valuable than Grace could easily articulate. Having her past definitively separated from her present meant building future without constant fear of exposure and judgment. Thank you, Major. That's more than generous, and I'm grateful beyond what words can express. He smiled, the expression transforming his military severity into something approaching warmth. Consider it wedding gift from an old man who has learned that second chances are precious and should be protected when we're fortunate enough to receive them. The afternoon stretched toward evening, and the celebration continued with music and dancing, food and conversation, all the elements of community gathering around significant life transitions. Grace danced with Nathaniel, his arms steady around her while they moved through simple patterns that did not require extensive skill, just willingness to navigate together and adjust when one or the other missed steps. You're radiant, he murmured against her hair. I know today has been challenging. All the scrutiny and questions, but you've handled everything with grace that makes the name your parents gave you feel prophetic. She smiled against his shoulder, allowing herself to relax into his embrace, despite audience of settlement residents and guests who watched with varying degrees of approval and skepticism. I'm just grateful to be here, building this life with you and the children. Everything else feels secondary to that central truth. They were interrupted by Mrs. Porter, her face flushed with exertion and something that looked like concern. Begging your pardon, but young Carrie is asking for you both. Says there's something important she needs to tell you and it can't wait. Grace and Nathaniel exchanged glances, worry spiking despite the celebratory atmosphere. They followed Mrs. Porter to the small room where Carrie had been playing with Ben and the other settlement children, finding her standing alone by the window with an expression that made Grace's maternal instincts flare with alarm. Sweetheart, what's wrong? Carrie turned, and Grace saw tears tracking down her cheeks despite obvious efforts to maintain composure. I saw Aunt Judith. She's here in the woods beyond the settlement. I went outside for fresh air and saw her standing in the trees watching the celebration. Nathaniel's expression hardened, his hand moving to Grace's lower back in protective gesture. Are you certain? She's supposed to be in Denver at the sanitarium. Carrie nodded vigorously, her small hands twisting together. I'm sure, Papa. She was wearing her black dress and her hair was loose, which I've never seen before. She looked. The child paused, searching for words to capture what she had perceived. She looked broken, like Ben's toy soldier after he dropped it from the loft and it shattered on the floor. Grace's stomach clenched with foreboding that had nothing to do with pregnancy nausea. Judith here, watching the celebration of Grace's permanent integration into the family she had tried to prevent from forming, represented danger Grace could not quite articulate, but felt with bone-deep certainty. Stay here with Mrs. Porter. Don't go outside or let Ben leave your sight. Your papa and I will find Judith and determine what she's doing here. They left Carrie in the housekeeper's capable hands and made their way outside, the celebration continuing behind them, while they moved toward the tree line where Carrie had reported seeing Judith. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, creating patterns of light and shadow that made distinguishing shapes difficult until they adjusted to the dimmer illumination beneath the forest canopy. They found Judith standing in the clearing where Grace's garden had been, where wildflowers had bloomed through summer and were now dying back into autumn dormancy. She wore her characteristic black dress, but in disarray Grace had never witnessed. Buttons misaligned and hem muddy, as if she had been walking rough trails without concern for appearance or propriety. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her face carried the hollow-eyed look of someone who had not slept in days or perhaps weeks. In her hands, she held a bundle of dried wildflowers, their stems brown and brittle, petals long since fallen to leave only the skeletal remains of what had once been beautiful. Judith, Nathaniel's voice carried warning and concern in equal measure. You're supposed to be in Denver. What are you doing at Cross Ridge? She looked up as if surprised by their presence, despite having been standing in plain sight where anyone from the celebration might have seen her. Her smile was terrible, too wide and lacking any warmth or sanity. I came to see the wedding, to witness my final defeat and acknowledge that I've lost everything I spent years trying to claim. Her gaze shifted to Grace, and the hollow eyes filled with something that looked almost like regret. You won, Miss Hartley. Mrs. Cross, I should say. You took everything I wanted and made it yours through being what I could never manage to be, genuinely lovable rather than merely useful. Grace felt Nathaniel tense beside her, his body coiling with readiness to respond to whatever Judith might do next. But Grace stepped forward, her hand raised in gesture, meant to calm rather than threaten. This isn't about winning or losing, Judith. It's about people finding connection and building families from whatever materials life provides. You could have had that too if you had been willing to look beyond obsession with what you thought you deserved. Judith laughed, the sound carrying notes of hysteria that made Grace's skin prickle with alarm. Could I? Could I have found love with someone who actually wanted me rather than tolerated me as useful household adjunct? I tried, Miss Hart. Mrs. Cross, I tried for years to be what Nathaniel needed, what Elena needed, what those children needed. But trying was never enough because I was trying to earn something that only comes as freely given gift. She looked down at the withered flowers in her hands, her voice dropping to something barely above whisper. Elena understood that. She knew she was loved despite her flaws and limitations. It's why she could choose death, because she knew she would be mourned and missed, and that her absence would leave genuine void rather than mere inconvenience. The insight was too accurate to be comfortable, and Grace found herself revising her understanding of Judith from simple villain to someone who had understood far too much while lacking the emotional tools to process that understanding constructively. It's not too late to build different life, Judith. The sanitarium offers treatment that might help you find peace with yourself and maybe eventually connection with others built on healthier foundations. Judith's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to identify individually, settling finally on something that looked almost like acceptance mixed with despair. It's far too late for me. I've burned every bridge and destroyed every possibility through actions I cannot undo and choices I cannot take back. But perhaps I can prevent further damage by removing the source of ongoing temptation and pain. She dropped the withered flowers and pulled from her dress pocket a small glass bottle that caught the light with ominous familiarity. Laudanum, the same drug she had used to violate Grace and Nathaniel, now cradled in her palm like solution to problems that had grown beyond her capacity to solve through any means except permanent exit. Nathaniel lunged forward, but Judith stepped back with surprising speed, her hand rising to her mouth with the bottle positioned to pour its contents down her throat before anyone could prevent the action. Don't do this, Judith. Whatever you've done, whatever pain you've caused or experienced, suicide is not the answer. Elena believed it was. And look at the devastation her choice created for everyone who loved her. Judith's hand trembled, the bottle wavering but not lowering. Perhaps that devastation was the point. Perhaps she wanted to punish those who had failed to save her from herself, to make certain her pain could not be forgotten or minimized into comfortable narratives about mental illness being no one's fault. Grace moved closer, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her chest. Or perhaps she was simply in too much pain to see alternatives, and she made a permanent decision based on temporary feelings that might have shifted if she had been able to hold on a little longer. Don't repeat her mistake, Judith. Choose differently than she did. For a suspended moment, it could have gone either way. Judith stood frozen with the bottle raised, in death a simple swallow away from ending pain that had become too large to contain in the fragile vessel of a human soul pushed beyond its breaking point. Then from the settlement came the sound of children's laughter. Carrie's voice rising above the others in joy that pierced the clearing's tension like arrow through paper. Judith's face crumpled, tears finally breaking through the rigid control that had governed her expressions for as long as Grace had known her. The bottle slipped from her fingers and shattered on the ground, laudanum soaking into earth where it could harm no one. Judith collapsed to her knees, hands covering her face as sobs racked her body, with the violence of dams finally bursting after too long holding back floods. Grace and Nathaniel moved simultaneously, each taking position on either side of Judith and lowering themselves to the ground beside her despite the mud and the broken glass scattered around them. They did not speak, simply sat witness to grief too long denied and pain finally given permission to express itself without the layers of control and pretense that had made acknowledgement impossible. When Judith's sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths and exhausted silence, Grace spoke with a gentleness that surprised even herself. "You're going to return to Denver with Major Whitmore, and you're going to accept the treatment they offer, and you're going to do the hard work of learning to live with yourself and your choices. Not because you deserve forgiveness, or because we're excusing what you did, but because the alternative is waste of a life that could still hold value if you can find courage to build differently than you've been building." Judith looked up with red-rimmed eyes, her face blotched and swollen from crying. "Why would you show me mercy after everything I've done to hurt you?" Grace's hand moved unconsciously to her belly where the child grew. The baby that existed because of Judith's violation, but who Grace could not bring herself to regret, despite how conception had occurred. Because choosing mercy over vengeance is how we break cycles and prevent our worst experiences from defining who we become. You made terrible choices, but you made them from a place of pain that deserves acknowledgement, even as we hold you accountable for harm caused. They helped Judith to her feet and walked her back toward the settlement where Major Whitmore waited, having been alerted by Mrs. Porter when Judith's presence became known. He took charge of the situation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises, arranging immediate departure for Denver and promising to ensure Judith received the most comprehensive treatment available. As the carriage pulled away carrying Judith toward whatever future might be salvaged from the wreckage of her choices, Grace leaned against Nathaniel and felt the baby move strongly in her womb, as if protesting all the drama, or perhaps celebrating its mother's capacity for choosing grace over the vengeance that would have been easier, but ultimately more corrosive. The celebration resumed once Judith's departure removed the shadow her presence had cast over the gathering. Grace and Nathaniel returned to their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, with the slightly shell-shocked demeanor of people who had just talked someone back from the edge of suicide and were still processing the emotional toll. But as evening settled and the party wound toward its natural conclusion, Grace found herself sitting on the porch of the main house with Carrie on one side and Ben on the other, watching the last guest depart into twilight that painted the valley in shades of purple and gold. "Mama Grace?" Carrie's voice was soft, tentative in the way she still sometimes spoke when broaching topics that felt important but uncertain. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you happy, being married to Papa and living at Cross Ridge and having a baby and all of it?" Grace pulled Carrie close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head while her other arm encircled Ben, who had snuggled against her opposite side. "I'm happier than I ever imagined I could be. Not because everything is perfect, or because we haven't all been through terrible things, but because we're choosing to build something beautiful from broken pieces, and that feels more valuable than anything that might have come easily." Ben looked up with his dark eyes serious beyond his 6 years. "Will the baby love us even though we're not its real sister and brother?" The question made Grace's throat tight, but she kept her voice steady. "You are its real sister and brother in every way that matters. Blood doesn't make family. Love and choice and showing up for each other through hard times makes family. And you two have already proven you're the best siblings anyone could hope for." Nathaniel emerged from the house and joined them on the porch, settling beside Grace and pulling them all into an embrace that felt like shelter and promise combined. They sat together watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. A family assembled from loss and violation and unexpected grace, choosing each other again in the quiet evening after a day that had tested and ultimately strengthened the bonds they were still learning to trust. The years that followed brought their share of challenges and joys in the unpredictable rhythm of lives lived honestly rather than according to scripts written by others. Grace gave birth to a daughter in February as winter still held the high country in its frozen grip. They named her Elena Rose, honoring the mother who had come before while claiming space for new growth that would not be limited by the past shadows. Carrie blossomed into a young woman of remarkable strength and compassion, her early trauma transforming through love and stability into capacity for deep empathy with others who had known loss. She pursued medical training, becoming one of the first women physicians in Colorado Territory and specializing in treating melancholy and other conditions that had claimed her mother and nearly destroyed her aunt. Ben discovered a gift for words, his childhood love of stories developing into genuine literary talent. He wrote novels set in mountain territories that captured both the beauty and brutality of frontier life. His work praised for its psychological depth and refusal to romanticize hardship, while still finding grace and notes of hope and human connection amid difficulty. The Crossridge School was established 2 years after Grace's return, a permanent building constructed with funds from Nathaniel's timber business and donations from families who had benefited from Grace's teaching. She ran the school for 20 years before passing its leadership to the next generation, her influence shaping hundreds of children who learned that education could be joyful and that teachers could be trusted not to abandon them when circumstances became challenging. Judith remained at the Denver Sanitarium for 3 years before the doctors deemed her stable enough for supervised independence. She moved to a small town in Wyoming where her history was unknown, found work as seamstress, and built a quiet life that would never include the grand romance she had once believed herself entitled to, but offered instead the harder-won satisfaction of learning to live with herself and the choices that had nearly destroyed her. 9 years after Grace's return to Cross Ridge, on a September afternoon when autumn sun painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold, the Cross family gathered in the garden Grace had restored and tended through every season since. The wildflowers bloomed in riotous profusion. Generations of plants descended from the seeds she had first scattered in hope and faith that dead ground could support life again. Elena Rose, now 7 years old and as fierce as her namesake, but tempered with her mother's gentleness, ran through the flowers with the abandon of a child who had never known want or instability. Behind her came the twins, born 3 years after Elena, and named Thomas and Catherine for the grandparents who had passed but whose love lived on in children who carried their names and something of their spirits. Carrie sat on a bench with a medical text open in her lap, preparing for examinations that would certify her for independent practice. Ben perched in the apple tree Nathaniel had planted the year of his marriage to Grace, notebook balanced on his knee while he captured in words the scene unfolding around him. Grace worked in the garden alongside Nathaniel, their movements coordinated from years of partnership in this space and in the larger work of building family and community from intentions rather than accidents. Her hair showed threads of silver now, and lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes from squinting into mountain sun and smiling at children, and life lived fully rather than merely survived. Nathaniel looked older too, the grief that had once defined his features replaced by something that looked like contentment, earned through choosing love over fear whenever the choice presented itself. He had learned to laugh again, to take pleasure in small moments, to believe that happiness was not betrayal of those lost, but rather honoring of their memory through refusing to let loss define all subsequent living. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked, the question emerging from nowhere but feeling like something that needed voicing. "Choosing me despite the scandal and the complications and the way nothing about our beginning was conventional or easy." Nathaniel set down the shovel he had been using to prepare beds for winter planting and pulled her close, his hands settling at her waist with the familiarity of long practice. "I regret every moment I wasted being afraid instead of choosing you immediately. I regret failing to defend you in Denver and letting you leave believing I valued propriety over love. But I don't regret a single moment since you agreed to give me another chance to be the man you deserved." He kissed her then, long and deep in full view of the children who made exaggerated gagging sounds, but smiled while they did it because they had grown up knowing love could look like this. Imperfect and hard-won, but genuine in its commitment to showing up and choosing each other through whatever came. When they finally broke apart, Grace rested her head against Nathaniel's shoulder and surveyed the garden that had started everything. The flowers that had taught her that dead things could bloom again if someone cared enough to tend them through their dormancy. I want to tell you something I learned through all of this. Something I hope the children understand too as they build their own lives. Nathaniel's arms tightened around her, his voice rumbling through his chest where her ear rested. "What's that?" Grace smiled, the words coming clear as the mountain air that surrounded them. Some love stories don't start with fireworks. They start with wildflowers in winter and patience to wait for spring. They start with choosing to care for dead gardens, believing that beneath the surface, life is waiting for the right conditions to emerge. They start with being brave enough to say yes when every practical consideration suggests no, and then being brave enough every day afterward to keep saying yes, despite new difficulties that make the first choice look easy in retrospect. She pulled back to look at his face, wanting him to see her certainty. "That's the kind of love that lasts, Nathaniel. Not the easy kind that comes from perfect circumstances and requires no effort to maintain, but the kind built from choosing each other repeatedly, from tending gardens through every season and trusting that beauty will return even when winter makes such faith seem foolish." Nathaniel's eyes held the shimmer of tears he no longer tried to hide, his voice thick with emotion when he responded. "I choose you, Grace Cross, today and every day forward until I have no more days left to make the choice. You are my wildflower that bloomed in winter, the life that returned to dead ground, the proof that second chances are real if we're brave enough to reach for them." Elena Rose came running back from her exploration of the garden's far corners, her hands full of late-blooming asters and her face bright with discovery. "Mama, Papa, look! I found flowers that are purple and gold at the same time. Can we plant more of these so the whole garden turns these colors?" Grace crouched to admire her daughter's treasures, her heart full with the simple perfection of the moment. A child discovering beauty, a husband who had learned to choose love over fear, older children building lives that would honor the struggles that had brought the family to this point while not being limited by those struggles. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it when she fled Philadelphia's scandal and accepted the teaching position at Cross Ridge. Not escape from difficulty, but rather the opportunity to build something that mattered from whatever materials life provided, however broken or unconventional those materials might be. "We can plant as many as you like, sweetheart. Gardens should be filled with the colors and flowers that bring joy to the people who tend them." As evening settled over Cross Ridge and the family began gathering tools and children for the return to the main house, Grace paused one last time to look at the garden that had survived neglect and violation and near abandonment, that had bloomed again through patience and care and faith that life could return even to the deadest ground. She thought of Judith in Wyoming, building small life from the ruins of obsession. She thought of Elena sleeping in the cemetery on the ridge, finally at peace after struggles no one had been able to relieve while she lived. She thought of all the people who had shaped her journey to this moment, the good and the terrible alike, understanding that Grace was not erasing the past, but rather choosing to build futures that were not limited by what had come before. The last light faded from the western sky, and stars emerged in the gathering darkness like promises waiting to be claimed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices to make about how to love and build and tend the gardens, both literal and metaphorical, that made up a life worth living. But tonight, walking back to the house with Nathaniel's hand warm in hers and children's laughter echoing through the evening air, Grace allowed herself to simply be grateful for the journey that had brought her here and the people who had chosen to make that journey alongside her. Some flowers bloom in winter. Some love stories start in grief and scandal, in circumstances that should prevent their flourishing. But with patience and care and willingness to believe in resurrection, even when all evidence suggests death has won, gardens can bloom again, and hearts can heal, and families can be built from the most unlikely combinations of broken people choosing to be whole together. Grace Cross had learned this truth in the hard way that makes wisdom stick rather than sliding off surface understanding. And as she stood on the porch of the house that had become home, watching her family settle in for the evening and the settlement lights begin to glow against the darkness, she knew with certainty that every hard-won lesson had been worth the cost. The wildflowers would bloom again next spring, the garden would continue growing, The family would face new challenges and celebrate new joys. And through it all, the choice to love, intend, and believe in life's capacity for renewal would remain constant as the mountains themselves, foundation for building futures that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. This was grace, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of love strong enough to transmute suffering into growth, loss into connection, winter into the promise of spring, always waiting just beyond the frozen ground.